4, 1. We are live. Good morning, everyone. 1st February is indeed a significant day in life of every Indian citizen, as the Honorable Finance Minister rises to present the budget, which would pave way for the coming year's growth. While every year the budget has been important, but this year it holds greater relevance with optimism on the cards due to rebound of the economy, vaccination drive, and lower intensity of the third wave. This has raised hopes of the world with pandemic nearing the stage of endemic and making opportunities ripe for India. In such times, a positive and developmental budget was indeed need of the hour to not only ensure the country whether the budget did meet its purpose and what actually it brought with it shall be decoded in today's Scope's 29th webinar on Decoding the Union Budget 2022. We are joined by our eminent panelists who would help us understand the impact of the budget. Today, we are honored with the presence of Professor Bhanumurthy to unravel We also have the pleasure to welcome DG Scope, Shri Atul Sokti ji, who has been the visionary behind the innovative Scope's endeavors. We also welcome our subject matter experts to decode the tax implications of the budget from Deloitte. Please join me in welcoming Team Deloitte, led by Anuj Agarwal, followed by Richa Gupta, Saloni Roy, Pankaj Bagri, Divya Baveja, and Nitin Bejal. We are also happy to have with us Shri Saktimani ji, Director Finance, FACT, with us today. Thank you, sir, for sparing time for us. We're happy to share that today also we have participants joining us from the live platform, along with live streaming on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Before we move further, I'll take a few minutes to run through the interaction modalities. The participants joining live can put their questions in the Q&A tab in your Zoom platform. People who are joining us through the various social media streams can put their questions there, and we will pick it up from there and put up to the panelists. Now may I request DG Scope opening address. DG Sir is a visionary leader having a versatile professional experience of nearly 4 decades. Before leading Scope as Director General, Sir was CMD BHEL, a Maharatna public sector enterprise. In his guidance, Scope has transformed into an impactful organization while addressing various aspects relevant to the corporate sector. Over to you, sir, for your address.
Thank you. Thank you, Smriti. A very good morning to everyone. Today, in fact, Delhi has again become very chilly. I mean, a lot of cold waves are there. But I'm sure that during the discussions of today, everybody would feel the warmth of the discussions. It's really a pleasure for me, as Smriti mentioned, about this program, which is very sought after program on the decoding the union budget. And it's a real pleasure to be amongst all of you. Today, we have again got a very overwhelming response. Many of the participants joining to the social media as well as the Zoom platform. As was mentioned by Smriti, in fact, budget exercise is the most one of the most awaited events of the year. And this year, in fact, the importance of this particular budget was very significant, because one day before that, the economic survey, when it came, it talked about the rebounding of the economy, as well as the very high expectation about the GDP growth. And I'm sure the announcement which have been made, it will take us by 2023, it will take us back to the 2019 growth levels. And hopefully we will be able to achieve that. There has been a very positive development on the vaccination front also, as majority of the workforce which contribute to the country's GDP, they have been vaccinated. And in fact, economy is now in the right direction, and definitely a positive step toward the self-reliance and making the most of the opportunities which are available. So with this perspective in mind, the scope believes that this year's budget have paved a very constructive path, and very positive policy infusements are there. It balances, I believe, the short-term fiscal needs coupled with the structural reforms for medium and long-term growth. In fact, the budget talks a lot about the infrastructure, digital ecosystem, and inclusive growth, and what you call green environment, and restarting of the cycle of the investments and consumption. But if I talk from the perspective of scope as well as the public sector enterprise, few points which are coming to my mind, which are very important, where public sector enterprises can play a major role. One is, of course, the infrastructure development. Second is the digital ecosystem. Third is the skill development. And fourth is the energy transition to the green energy. And the fifth is the ease of doing business. These are 5 points, ease of doing business 2.0. These are the 5 points which are coming to my mind. If I talk about the infrastructure, government is earmarking 35% more than the previous budget estimates on the infrastructure. And total allocation is going to be 7 lakh crore rupees on the various sectors, including power, ports, transport, etc. And incidentally, another striking feature as mentioned is the building the digital ecosystem and the infrastructure. Public sector enterprises contribute to almost 12% of the GDP as per the last DP survey, which we have analyzed it. And the public sector enterprises in almost all the fields of the infrastructure. So we believe that the scale of investment which is required to meet the announcements or the plans, public sector enterprises have to play a major role. Next point, I will talk about the skill development. Skill development, public sector enterprises have direct employment of close to 1.5 million people, direct employment. And if we talk about the indirect employment, number of millions and millions of people are associated with the public sector. And a lot of programs are run by the public sector enterprise on the skill development, entrepreneurship, apprenticeship. And this is an area where public sector enterprise can play a major role. Just to share with you, at scope, in fact, 2 years back, just before the onset of the COVID, we had entered into an MOU with the Government of India, Ministry of Skill Development, on the apprenticeship and the skill development. And we have done a lot on that particular in this area. So this was skill development is another area beside the infrastructure development and the digital ecosystem where we can play a major role. Next point is the energy transition to the green energy. This is an area I like to share few figures with you, which are coming to my mind. In fact, if we do the analysis, greenhouse gas emissions, if you see, the total greenhouse gas emission in the country, 73% of the greenhouse gas emission comes from the energy sector. And almost 8% comes from the industry's process and products. And in all these areas, public sector enterprises are predominantly present. Maybe and due to inherent nature of their business, they have to contribute a lot in this climate action as well as energy transition. Just to quote few figures to you, share few figures with you. In the coal, 92%, close to 92% of the coal production in the country comes from the public sector enterprise. Gas, 83% comes from the public sector. Crude oil, almost 71% comes from the public sector. Power, more than half comes from the public sector enterprises. And steel, almost 17% comes from the public sector. So these are the areas where we have to play a major role, public sector enterprise. Coming to the scope. Scope, in fact, in this area has been doing a lot. We have entered into an agreement with GSZ Germany about 2 years back, We are doing a lot of capacity building. We have conducted a very detailed study, which is available on our website also. A number of capacity building programs have been introduced. A lot of hand holding is being done for some of the public sectors. A lot of work is being done in that particular area. Last point, which I mentioned, was the ease of doing business 2.0. This is an area a lot of work has to be done. In fact, I'm very happy to share the Department of Public Enterprises, they had entrusted scope with a task of visiting the DP guidelines. We know there are plethora of DP guidelines. They wanted us to give the suggestions on that which are the guidelines which can be totally dropped and which are the guidelines which can be changed. So we had set up a high-level committee under the chairmanship of Chairman IOC, where all the members of the many public sector were also there, and the detailed recommendations have already been submitted to the Department of Public Sector, Public Enterprises, about 2 weeks back, and I'm sure that these will be used while talking about the ease of doing business 2.0. So the point which I am trying to make is that in all the areas we can work, and we are doing the work as a public sector enterprise, also and at scope also as an apex body of PSCs. So this budget, we know the broad approach of the budget, but the intricacies of the budget or fine prints of budget that need to be understood, and I'm sure that all of us will get more knowledgeable and more aware about the intricacies of the budget. And in this direction, in fact, every year we are, as I mentioned, have been organizing this program. And we are honored to have with us Professor N.R. Bharumati ji, who is amongst a few economists. I know him from the last 3 years or so. And I have found that he is few economists who present the macroeconomic aspects in a very simplistic terms. And this time also, we look forward for yet another insightful session from you, Professor. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
And we also have the pleasure of having amongst us Mr. Shaktimani, a very close friend of mine. In fact, who is the Director of Finance of FSCT. And he is a blend of technical knowledge and finance knowledge. And he has a keen interest in this subject and has been inspiring and motivating scope in all its endeavors. Welcome to you, Mr. Shaktimani ji.
Looking forward to learning sessions.
Yeah, sure. Welcome. And I have always said that faculty is the most important strength for all our programs. That's the reason the scope programs have been very, very successful, because the faculty, we try to have the faculty who are very knowledgeable, who are very experienced, and we always try to get that kind of faculty. So we have a whole team of eminent panelists and the experts from the Deloitte, and they are with us from the last 3-4 years, analyzing the budget and helping us to understand the fine prints of budget. Welcome to the total team of the Deloitte. Due to the paucity of time, it will not be possible to mention everybody's name here, but you will be interacting with them in person when they start talking about their subject. So welcome to the Deloitte team. And with such panelists and who have the repository of knowledge amongst us, I'm sure that today's session would be very enlightening session, and would further enhance with the enthusiastic participation of there are a number of board members who have joined on the Zoom platform, as well as social media. Senior officers are there, colleagues are there, and I'm sure that all of you would take this opportunity and optimize this opportunity and participate wholeheartedly. Whatsoever advantage of this program is that whatsoever comes to our mind, and we are scared of asking those questions anywhere else, we can ask here these questions here and get the clarification from the experts in a free and frank form of discussion. Again, a warm welcome to the session, which I'm sure that this would be a great success. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. And thank you for linking how scope is relevant to the budget and how we can strengthen public sector enterprises and the corporate sector in furthering the objectives of the budget. With economic perspective of the budget 2022. Professor N.R. Bhanumurthy is presently the Vice Chancellor of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar School of Economics, University, Bengaluru, and has expertise in areas of macro monetary economics, fiscal policy, international money and finance, macroeconomic modeling, and developmental economics. Professor has served on over 22 government committees constituted by different ministries, including finance, statistics, rural development, Niti Aayog, RBI, etc. Sir also has been the secretary of the Indian Econometrics Society since 2006 and is also managing trustee of Indian Economic Association Trust for Advisory, Research and Development since 2010. Presently, he is serving on the Advisory Committee on Ways and Means Advances to State Governments constituted by RBI. With over 70 research papers and 5 books to his credit, I now invite Professor N.R. Bhanumurthy for enlightening us on the macroeconomic aspect. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Sabridhi. First of all, let me thank Scope for inviting me to this budget session. I especially thankful to Shri Sopti ji. I think we have been interacting for the past 4 years, but my association with Scope goes little far back, maybe almost 10 years now. I have been part of the Scope discussion on the budget and also on overall macroeconomics. I'm also thankful to Deloitte. I'm looking forward to listening to them, and also thankful to Sri Sakti Maniji, who is also part of this discussion. So with regard to the budget, I think there are a lot of things have been written on the budget till now for the past 48 hours, and so much of discussion happened on what exactly is in the budget. And we also know that this is one of the shortest budget, and so in that sense, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to put a little more of a macro perspective, the overall thinking of the government, whether it's good for the economy, and what would be its medium-term to long-term implications. First of all, I think those who heard the Finance Minister's budget speech, I think the government has taken a little longish perspective on the overall macroeconomic policies. So they talk about the next 25 years, not really next 1 or 2 years or 5 years, but I think it's going to be for next 25 years. So the way I understand the budget is, we do see in the general discussion in the media or in the academia that there's a lot of discussion about the government need to really pump prime the economy, create more demand, create more jobs, and spend more money on social sector, rural development. So there are so much of discussion that have been happening. And in a way, it brings back to the whole textbookish kind of a argument. What is that the government need to focus, whether it's a growth or development. So the growth versus development debate has been there for quite some time in this country, and it's an ongoing debate. So right now, in my view, the government seems to have taken a view that the growth becomes utmost important if you want to really address the developmental issues. So in a sense, the causality seems to be assumed that it should be growth first and then then the development. And I think that kind of a focus is reflected in all the parameters that we talk about, whether you look at revenue deficit as a ratio to fiscal deficit, or the revenue expenditure as a ratio to capital expenditure. You do see that there is a tilt in all the indicators towards growth-oriented expenditures. And as Mr. Sopti pointed out very clearly, the government actually focusing heavily on public investment. I think that actually brings back the whole role of public sector enterprises. And now in the crisis, it looks like it is the public sector and the public sector enterprises. They're going to be a solution for bringing the economy back to 7% or 8% growth that we are talking about. Again, those who read my write-up in the past 1 year or maybe past 10 years, I think I've been talking this particular issue. Maybe I should not talk anymore right now, because now everybody started talking about the role of government capital expenditure, right? In fact, you would see that, everybody say that the capital expenditure has a larger multiplier compared to the revenue expenditure. The multiplier is supposed to be 2.45 for the capital expenditure, compared to the revenue expenditure is less than one when it comes to the revenue expenditure for the central government. So this 2.45 number that I have given in 2012, and since 10 years, I've been talking about this, the role of capital expenditure. And now that everybody's talking, I think I must stop talking about that particular aspect. So it took 10 years to really to bring this whole concept of the role of government capital expenditure. So now that everybody's talking, I think I should stop talking about it. And I also argued that, there is a need for continuation. In fact, one of the best budgets that we have seen in the last maybe 10 years or so was the last year budget, where they have done all the base work to really bring the economy back to the medium-term perspective of 7 to 8%. Although they did not really talk about the 5 trillion economy, I think back of their mind, I think the target of achieving 5 trillion economy seems to be definitely be there when they proposed a shifting from revenue to capital expenditure. If you look at this yesterday's numbers, as clearly the capital expenditure has increased as a ratio to GDP from 2.2 to 2.6%. On the other hand, the revenue expenditure, the revenue deficit that we talk about, is actually reduced substantially compared to the increase in the capital expenditure. That is, it has been brought down by almost 0.9% of GDP for the next year. So in that sense, it is clearly, again, those who attended my past talks, I'm sure you remember, the fiscal consolidation. Generally, there is a misconception that fiscal consolidation is a fiscal compression mechanism. Rather, actually, fiscal consolidation is more of an expenditure switching mechanism from revenue deficit to capital expenditure. And that is exactly what it has been done. And we do see that going forward, the same strategy would certainly help India to recover on a permanent basis, not just as a one-off event that we have seen that 9.2% for the current year, but I think on a durable basis that the economy is going to really recover to 7 to 8%. In terms of little disappointments, I must say that again, I have written something in today's Financial Express that there is a little bit of uncertainty in the overall fiscal roadmap. And for the second consecutive year, the government has not really brought out the medium-term fiscal framework. And they say that there's a lot of uncertainty in terms of the pandemic. And that's one of the reasons they kept that degrees of freedom in terms of the kind of roadmap that they would like to have for the next 4 to 5 years. So in a way, I thought there is a fear, at least it's my personal fear, that there's a fear that we might be completely or at least partially shelving that whole FRBM Act that we are talking about. This is the second consecutive year, so we don't know what happens in going forward. So I thought that there should have been some kind of a predictability in terms of what the medium-term fiscal path going to be. So that seems to be missing. And if you look at the kind of adjustment that has been done in the overall expenditures, there are two things that happened. One, the substantial reduction in the subsidies. I guess that is that actually doesn't reflect that the government is planning to reduce the subsidy. It is actually reflects upon the improved public expenditure efficiency. I think this particular aspect has been missing in the last 48 hours. I think the reason why we are seeing the decline in the the overall subsidy is largely due to improved public expenditure efficiency in terms of subsidy delivery mechanism. I'm sure those who work in the public sector, they know much better than what I'm actually saying, particularly when you talk about the fertilizer subsidy. I'm sure Sri Shaktimani knows better than what I'm saying. So in a sense, there is a substantial improvement in the overall public expenditure efficiency. And again, it took a long time for us to really, talk about that. And although there is a very, very small point, many of you think that is an extremely small point, but I think that had a huge impact on the overall public expenditure efficiency in the last 7 years. And this government, if at all, one important positives, if anybody asks me, is improving the public expenditure efficiency. And I think the use of digital technology, JAM Trinity, seems to be really helping reducing the subsidy component. One important link in this whole mechanism is the financial inclusion, right? I think the Jan Dhan accounts and all those things. And I'm glad, in fact, in 2014, June, when the new government came, somebody asked me that, in fact, I wrote in the newspaper, what should be the priority of the new government? And again, if somebody wants to look at it, they can look at. I said that apart from revenue deficit reduction and all those things, which is the macro numbers, and one small point which I said, which at that point of time felt it was very important, was making India Post as a core banking compliance. I mean, everybody ignored that, and now I realize now in the yesterday budget, the government seems to have come out with that statement that all the India Posts would become core banking compliant. So it has a major role. I think, again, those who really read the headlines, it looks like it's a very small thing, but those who actually go to the field and rural areas, I think, and I would like to attribute the decline in the overall subsidy, especially people talk about there's a decline in the rural development expenditure, or the decline in many of the centrally sponsored schemes. And I think it's largely because of the financial inclusion, especially because of the India Post that we see in the rural areas. I think that needs to be really highlighted in a big way when we talk about decline in the subsidies. In terms of, and in fact, there's one thing which I really liked in the budget is not really talking about privatization of public sector banks. In fact, that is linked to this whole argument that I've been making, that the role of public sector banks and India Post has a huge impact on the way we do public expenditures on the social sector. So I was glad to see that there is no discussion on, there was no talk on privatization of public sector banks. Even the post-budget, interviews. When it comes to the other two important aspects, one is a lot of people talk about inflation, and there is something like unemployment. So these are the two things which everybody felt the government has not really addressed in the budget. So I thought, let me highlight those two issues. When it comes to inflation, there are a lot of people saying that the inflation is going to slip outside that Monetary Policy Committee target of 6%. But my own view is that given that RBI is in full control of the monetary policy, in fact, their improved predictive capacity in terms of the inflation trajectory seems to be helping us in containing the inflation within the band of 2 to 6%. Whether this budget is going to be inflationary, I don't think so, because of the fact that there is a decline, there is a shift in the expenditure from consumption to capital. So the capital expenditure, as I said, again, the multiplier becomes a major factor here. In fact, it is producing more commodities rather than creating just the demand. So that supply is going to be increasing much more than the demand. So the budget, a lot of proposals in the budget need not be inflationary in my view, and rather it is going to put a lower pressure on the inflation going forward. And added to that, we are expected to see better agriculture production, and we already seen that the customs duties have been brought down in the domestic fuel prices. So all those things we should ensure the inflation should be within that 2 to 6% range. Although there are upside risk that is coming from the international oil prices, and it looks like the government seems to assume the international oil prices somewhere close to $70 to $72. But I think right now what we are seeing is it is much more than that. We have seen almost 15 to 20% increase in the international oil price in the last 15 to 20 days. So there are pressures. I think I'm sure the government and the RBI has many more instruments to contain the inflationary pressure. If you look at the assumption of the nominal GDP growth, again, many people felt that it is very, very conservative, and they assumed 11.1% GDP growth for the next year. And even if you assume that inflation is going to be, the real GDP growth is going to be 6.5 to 7%, we still know that the inflation will be less than 6%. So despite assuming a very a low real GDP growth, we should end up in having better inflation numbers going forward. In terms of employment, I think the government, again, as I said, unlike there are many leading indicators, we talk about many leading indicators. Employment as such is a coincident indicator, rather, or we can always say that lagging indicator. That means it follows the growth pattern, it follows the growth, the structure of the growth pattern that we are talking about. So given the kind of focus that the government has made, I would expect that the employment opportunities actually is expected to increase in the coming period. And I think if you look at yesterday's data for the month of January, we have already seen that the unemployment rate is actually declining very sharply. In fact, from 7.9% in December, it has come down to 6.4 or 6.6%. So going forward, given the kind of focus, in fact, all these things are actually is outcome of this fiscal strategy that was adopted in the last budget itself. So we have already seen 5.5 lakh crore investments in the current year, that is FY22, and then we are talking about 7.5 lakh crore investments in the next year. And added to that, the best part of this budget is also try to handhold the state governments, right? We have seen that the allocations to state governments, in addition to all the transfers and all those things, the grant in aid component of the capital expenditure has been increased by 90,000 crore. So I think it all will have a positive impact on state's economy and also create more employment opportunities. So in that sense, I would expect the whole proposals. First, it will not be inflationary, and second, I think it will have a positive impact on employment opportunities. One small concern that I had is that increasing public debt. I think this is something, again, last year also I spoke about it. Now, right now, officially, they're saying that it's going to be somewhere close to 60% and above for the central government. So if you add the state governments, I think together we are looking at somewhere close to 95% of GDP, again, as the Finance Commission target of bringing down to less than 70%. So I think one major downside risk that India is facing at the moment going forward is, ever rising public debt. I think that should really, alert the political economy to really bring in the medium-term perspective on overall, fiscal policy. So in terms of tax revenues, again, there are a lot of people have written about it. Government seems to be conservative and all those things. And they're predicting a lower tax revenues in the next year. I know Deloitte is going to talk more about it, but I think intrinsically, what is happening is that there is a general decline in the indirect taxes. I think that is what they're predicting. And in fact, the revenue secretary said it is purely because the reduction in the customs duties and all those things. But if you look at the other component of the indirect taxes, the GST, I felt that there seems to be a little more optimistic. The government seems to be a little more optimistic. And my own estimates are saying that the buoyancy, the GST buoyancy, they expect a larger buoyancy the next year compared to the current year. So I think that seems to be on the upside, but on other taxes, we know why there's going to be decline in the tax revenues. And another disappointment from the budget is those who heard this the whole 90-minute speech. At least I could not really get much in terms of what the government is planning to do in terms of the customs duties, right? We expect that the government going forward, it needs to make it predictable, simple, and all those things. But I think when it comes to customs duties, I was feeling that at least I didn't understand what we are planning to do when it comes to customs in the tariff lines and all those things. Again, I wrote some time back. One thing that I was looking for the budget was to really reduce the customs duties. Even I think today also Arvind Pangaria sir has written that I think if at all you want to be competitive, you cannot go with more customs tariffs or tariff lines, and in the name of domestic protection. I thought that was something that not really going well with our objective of increasing share of exports in the global market. And again, I keep saying that exports in India, especially the manufacturing sector, is actually increasingly import-led. I think that seems to be not able to be, I thought people are still not able to understand this particular aspect. It's an import-led export growth hypothesis is still valid when it comes to the manufacturing sector. And I'm sure the public sector enterprises, all of them know about it. But I think, I may still have to continue to write on this before it becomes part of general understanding. So that particular aspect was something which I felt the government should have really looked at. But otherwise, the overall, I must say that it's a growth-oriented budget. Again, everybody said about it. But at the same time, there are medium-term uncertainties. I'm not saying that there's a difference between risk and uncertainty, right? So there is a lot of uncertainty when it comes to the medium-term fiscal roadmap. So that is something I think the government as well as the academia need to really work on, so that there could be some predictability in the medium term. And there are a lot of criticism about reduction of allocation to social sector. I think partly it is right. In its valid criticism, especially when it comes to health and education, especially when we are the most of the, we are going to implement the national education policy from the current year. And, we all know the kind of pressure the health sector faced. Given that kind of situation, it was only expected that, the allocations to this particular sector should have gone up. But I thought the government seems to have taken a different view. And we do see that there is a decline in the overall education and health allocations. But I'm not worried about the MGNREGS decline, because we know that it's going to be a demand-driven package. And as and when there is a demand from the states, through supplementary grants. I think there will be some kind of allocation. So I have a mixed reaction on that. But I thought the governments should have spent more on health and education, and perhaps indirectly it looks like although there is a broad national policy, but when it comes to implementation, it has been left to the state governments, to really increase their allocation. And there could be an argument that there is an increase in the untied grants to the states by almost 10 percentage points as per the 14th Finance Commission. So maybe the states are asked to spend more on health and education. Whatever it is, when it comes to the general government, we all need to really look at increasing allocations towards health and education. So especially when we are in challenging times like the implementation of NEP and other health related aspects. So overall, as I said, I'm very happy about this budget because it has a continuity, it has a broadly predictability, and it has it has a economic logic also, in my view. And I think one small point I would like to highlight, and I would like to stop here. I'm just thinking aloud. I think from now onwards, maybe the government need to really present their fiscal accounts, rather what we say that fiscal deficit net of this disinvestment. Because if you look at the last 5-6 years, the kind of marksmanship what we talk about is actually disturbed by one major variable, which is disinvestment, right? And I think now onwards we need to really talk about fiscal deficit net of disinvestment. I think that's a better way to do it. And whatever the disinvestment proceeds that we talk about, we generate, I think we need to use those disinvestments for releasing the public debt rather than adding to the non-debt creating capital receipts component. So in that sense, it will become much more predictable for us, rather than the whole volatility that we see in the last maybe 10 years or so is actually being determined by the volatility or the success of the governments in generating a disinvestment proceeds from compared to what they've actually planned. So that is one thing I thought we need to really address when it comes to the presentation of the budgets. So now onwards, I don't think people will take disinvestment numbers very seriously. So in that sense, I think we need to remove that disinvestment from outside the fiscal deficit estimation process. So let me thank Scope again for giving me this opportunity. Despite being out of Delhi, people remember me, so I'm thankful to all of you. And thanks to this webinar, so I still continue to be part of this Scope discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for an enlightening talk. And sir, it's very difficult to not remember you on this important day. The simplicity with which you address the economics aspects is beyond par, and we really appreciate your association with Scope. Thank you, sir. Now, with Professor demystifying the economy behind the budget, we present Deloitte team to you. However, I would just like to highlight before that we have been receiving many questions and directly directed at you, Professor. So please stay with us so that we can solve everyone's queries. And but to remind the participants that we'll be taking up the questions after the presentation by Deloitte. And till then, please keep posting your questions on the Q&A tab. And for the people who are joined through the social media, please put your questions in the comment section. We request all the participants to please use the Q&A tab for the question answer session. Now with this, I would invite Anuj Agrawal from Deloitte along with his team of experts to enlighten us about the taxation aspects of the budget, which we are awaiting very, very eagerly. So over to you, Anuj.
Samriddhi. Really glad to be here, and always a delight to hear Mr. Professor Bhanumurthy talk about the budget proposals from macroeconomic perspective. Samriddhi, if you can put up the slides as I move along. So the way we have structured the presentation is we will first start with transfer pricing. There are not many amendments from transfer pricing front, so that should take around 3 to 5 minutes. Then we get to direct tax, will take around 1 hour there. Then to personal taxation, 15-20 minutes, and then we move to indirect taxes, another 15-20 minutes, and then we'll have around 30 minutes or so for the Q&A session towards the end. So we'll start with transfer pricing. I would request Richa if you can share some insights on amendments from transfer pricing standpoint.
Yeah, thanks, Anuj. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for inviting us for this session today. If we can move on to the slide on transfer pricing. There have not been much changes in transfer pricing. There was some expectation that the rules and the procedural aspects around having some timelines for the CIT appeals, having some timelines for the APA processes would be put in place. However, there has been, so one way to look at it is there's not been, no tinkering has been done. So, to that extent, the continuity of the regulation is maintained. The two changes that have come, which are again more procedural, we've had the experience of faceless assessment for income taxes. It was expected that the faceless scheme would be extended to transfer pricing assessment and scrutiny as well, including the DRP mechanism, which reviews the TP orders once they are issued by a panel of 3 commissioners. However, that the rules to enable faceless assessments for transfer pricing, the timeline for that has been deferred from 2022 till 2024. So the department is going to take another 2 years to put together a scheme for extending faceless processes for transfer pricing, the scrutiny for international transactions for multinational corporations. The other procedural aspect that has been clarified, that the powers of revising the order under 263 also extends to transfer pricing orders. There was some confusion, and there was also some tribunal orders which had said that the provision does not extend specifically to transfer pricing orders, and it is more for the assessment orders. However, the budget has clarified that it includes the transfer pricing assessment orders as well. So both of them are procedural clarifications. Some of the key asks that were there with companies that have international transactions on using, we are celebrating 20 years of transfer pricing in India. Celebrating may not be the right word, but 20 years ago, the transfer pricing regulations were introduced. So there was a lot of expectation that the government would use the 20 years worth of experience that they have garnered in bringing out, certain clarity, certain, the notifications to say that these transactions are to be addressed in a certain way that would make the process of complying with transfer pricing and make the litigation for transfer pricing come down a bit. So that is something which is still expected. Maybe we will see it once the risk assessment procedures are notified for transfer pricing appropriately. So that is something we have to watch out for in the coming budgets. So thank you so much. Over to you, Anuj.
Thanks, Richa. We'll get to direct tax proposals now. And before I start, I'm joined by Pankaj Bagri. He is a subject matter expert on direct tax. Pankaj, before I get into the slides, do you want to just lay the context from tax policy landscape standpoint?
Yeah, Anuj. Thank you, Anuj. Good morning, the participants, and thank you to Scope for inviting the Lloyd team, to give the budget session from the tax perspective. I would go back to what Professor Bhanumurthy laid down from the economic standpoint in terms of the growth-oriented budget, that was laid down by the finance minister, and how is the need of the hour to spend a lot of money towards the capital investments, and obviously PSUs would be a big pillar in terms of doing the capex. I could relay this intent of the government with various amendments that has been brought in on direct tax as well as indirect tax. Clearly, the thrust of the government has been to boost Make in India, manufacturing in India, and we see a lot of developments or amendments either in direct tax or indirect tax, extension of the manufacturing concessional tax regime by 1 year, increasing the custom duties, I think is all in a direction to kind of boost the manufacturing in India. I think what is also important to note that, the government is trying to be stable as far as the tax amendments or policies are concerned. And that's why I think 2-3 years back when finance minister laid down the roadmap that, clearly we're looking at a lower corporate tax rate with minimal incentives, like, a kind of a more rationalized kind of, simple law to comply with. I think it is following the similar trend, and that's why you don't see any surprises in the direct tax proposals with vis-a-vis the changes in the corporate tax and the other amendments. I think what is also relevant or important to note in this budget is government has tried to provide a lot of clarification on the procedural side. It has attempted to rationalize various provisions, but by doing so, it has actually overturned a lot of favorable High Court and Supreme Court orders, which were in favor of the taxpayer. So while it does provide a certainty from the litigation point of view, but I'm not sure whether it, kind of completely is in favor of the taxpayer, some of these amendments. Thirdly, I think government continues to stay on track and abide by, the stated objective is not to have the retrospective amendments, what we used to see many years ago. Having said which, we do see some of the retrospective amendment coming in this budget as well. In fact, in some of the places, while the amendment is prospective, but the language doesn't seem to be prospective. Probably, we'll take you through on some of these amendments. I think what is very, important and a point to highlight or note in this budget is, on an overall basis, the focus that the government is laying down on these systems, on the technology aspect. I think, Finance Minister in her budget speech spoke a lot about the digital currency to be introduced. For the first time under direct tax laws, we have, taxation of the virtual digital assets, so I think a lot of emphasis on the technology. And if one needs to take a cue from this budget, I think we are expecting a lot of amendments, a lot of policies around the digital kind of assets that people would hold going forward. So with that note, how we have divided our corporate tax amendment is myself and Anuj will lead this session, and we'll take you through the direct tax amendments. I'll pass it on to Anuj to take us through the amendments, and I'll pitch in the appropriate place. Over to you, Anuj.
Sure. Thanks, Pankaj. So we'll get going on corporate tax first. The first slide on the corporate tax rate card. It's really a menu of corporate tax rates. As you see in the headline, there is no change in tax rates, neither for domestic companies nor for foreign companies. It remains as is. So domestic companies, it varies from 15% to 22% to 30% in some cases, depending upon their turnover thresholds, depending upon their characterization, if it is a manufacturing company or a service company. So it remains unchanged. And probably, I think Professor Bhanumurthy earlier talked about tax buoyancy in the run-up to the budget, while I think the targets may have revised, but we talk about overall tax collections, it exceeded, I think, past year's target, and they now stack to 22.1 trillion for 21-22. Probably, I think that would have given government some wiggle room to stabilize tax rates, and which is why we see no change in the tax rates on the screen. The minor tweaks are with respect to surcharge, which is really an additional levy which is imposed on income tax. Surcharge was earlier applicable on a graded basis. It was applicable, say, from 5%, 10%, 15, 25. It goes up as high as 37% when the income level exceeds 5 crores. Now that highest level of surcharge, which is 25 and 37, these two levels of surcharge are now capped to 15% in case of a taxpayer, which is an AOP, and where and that AOP has members as companies. Now, we look at, this could be particularly relevant for government public sector enterprises where they have contracts, large EPC contracts, and they award these contracts to a consortium of members involving companies. And generally in these big contracts, we see different companies coming together because of high financial stakes, because of high competencies required to deliver on the projects. And therefore these companies are coming together, forming a consortium. And if consortium triggers an AOP, which is a separate tax concept, and the rate of tax for AOP could have gone as high as 42% if you were to consider the highest level of surcharge. Now, with this capping of surcharge on taxation of AOP, the effective tax rate of AOP comes down by roughly 2.5% to 4.5% in some cases. So I think that is a positive move. It will help government PSEs, where particularly in cases of tax protected contracts, where effective India taxes are on account of the project owners.
So I think, Anuj, the only point over here is, while the surcharge is capped at 15% for the AOP, what is important to note is that this applies in case where the members of the AOP are, companies. While it is not very often you see, but you have AOPs where the participants or the members could be LLP or partnership firms. So I think this surcharge doesn't apply, the lower surcharge, to such AOPs. I think that's an important point to note.
Sure. We can move on now to the next slide. Yeah, so we'll start with the key tax proposals. On the left-hand side, what you see is deductions. And when I say deductions, I mean deductions of expenses while calculating taxable business income. And as Pankaj said in the starting, there have been some proposals, tweaks in the finance bill, which in a way seem to override the High Court decisions, the Supreme Court decisions, and in a way provide clarity, which is eventually against taxpayers. So these are on the left-hand side, these three amendments, which in a way are overriding court decisions and providing the government's intent on certain positions in law. We'll start with the first point on the left-hand side, provision for disallowance of expense. The first bullet talks about an expense which is incurred in relation to earning exempt income. That expense is not to be allowed. This is really on the principles of parity, that if you earn income which is exempt, likewise expenditure should also not be allowed when it is incurred in relation to earning exempt income. And this was more relevant when we had a dividend taxation regime, which earlier was exempt for shareholders, and there was any expenditure, say loan taken to incur or to make investments which yielded dividends. That loan was or interest was not allowed as an expense because it is incurred in relation to earning exempt income. Now, what this amendment does is it clarifies that even if in a year there is no exempt income earned, but expense is incurred, that expense is still to be disallowed. And why is there this amendment is because there have been court rulings earlier, and there have been court rulings of different high courts. Name a few. There were Madras High Court decision in Reddington, another High Court decision in ILFS Energy Development, which have very expressly said that that in a year, if there is no exempt income earned, and there cannot be a question of disallowance of expense, because it has to be expenditure incurred in relation to earning of a real income. There cannot be a notional income and you disallow expense towards it. So that High Court decisions have been overturned. The law is very clear now that that any expenditure incurred, even if there is no exempt income, is to be disallowed. And this is prospectively applicable from financial year 2021-22 onwards. I go to the next deduction provision, which is a deduction provision under section 43B, dealing with the deduction of interest. Now, there is a provision in the law which requires deduction of interest only on payment basis. The existing law also provides a feature that if an outstanding interest is converted into a loan or a borrowing, then that is not to be treated as payment, and accordingly interest should not be allowed. And the language is very specific in the law, and is limited to conversion of interest to loan or borrowing. There is no reference to any third instrument like conversion into a debenture or any other instrument. And there have been court rulings where taxpayers have taken a point of view that if outstanding interest is converted into a debenture or any other like instrument, then that is not fitting within the law, and it should be deemed as constructive payment of interest and should be allowed as a deduction. And this point of view is also endorsed by Supreme Court in MM Aqua decision, and therefore taxpayers were claiming deduction on conversion of interest into debentures. What this amendment does is it clarifies, it plugs this loophole, says that any conversion of interest into debenture or like instruments is not to be allowed as a deduction going forward. Again, applicable prospectively. But as Pankaj said in the start, while these amendments are made applicable prospectively, but the language is that it is clarified and it is deemed to have always been the position that it was never intended to cover conversion into debenture, because the language is such that it seems to suggest that the intention was always this from the very beginning, and therefore it could probably color minds of cases which are presently pending before courts and tribunals. Now we come to third point on the left hand side. This is an expense which is allowed under Section 37. For the benefit of everyone, Section 37 under the tax law is a residual section where deduction of expense is allowed deduction for any expense is allowed for which is incurred in the course of carrying on business or profession. There are some restrictions. There are some limitations where deduction is not allowed, and these limitations are expenses incurred for which are on personal account, which are punitive in nature, and which are of capital account. These three types are not to be allowed. What this amendment does is threefold. Number one, it says any expenditure incurred for a purpose which is an offense under any law, it could be Indian law or foreign law, that expense is not to be allowed. Second, any expense incurred for compounding an offense which is prohibited under any law, Indian law, foreign law, is not to be allowed. Number three, any sum provided as a benefit or a perquisite to a person which is in violation of any applicable rules or regulations, again, is not to be allowed. So, and maybe one example I can think of is ICMR regulations, Indian Council of Medical Regulations, where we see a big pharma companies extending gifts, grants, payments to medical practitioners. And the regulations, while clearly provide that those extension of benefits are not to be allowed, and therefore, if there's a pharma company extending these benefits to say medical practitioners, that will be disallowed for the pharma companies. So I think this is what it does. Again, it overturns some of the decisions, very settled decisions of courts, and seems to be stating a point of view that the government believes has been the intent from the very beginning. Before I move to the right hand side, Pankaj, anything you have to add?
So Anuj, I think what is important is again the fact that while the intention is to provide this certainty, but it is overturning some of the High Court, Supreme Court judgments, and which have given some interesting observation while coming to the conclusion. So I think what I can foresee in future is litigation around whether these amendments are prospective or retrospective. While in hopefully in the corrigendum there should be some clarification provided by the finance minister, else the language is not in sync with the amendment date put out in the finance bill. So I think unless that gets clarified, we can expect further litigation on all these 3 points.
Very true. Yeah. Okay, moving on. Treatment of cess and surcharge on the right hand side, top point. It has always been a point of doubt as to whether surcharge or cess is included within the meaning of tax. And the reason why this doubt is taxpayers have been claiming deduction of cess, which is really a percentage paid on additionally on tax, whether cess is included within the meaning of tax or not. So under the existing law, any tax paid on business, on profits and gains earned from business is not to be allowed. Now, whether cess is included in tax, if yes, then it should also not be allowed as a deduction. And if it is not included, it can be claimed as an expense. Again, there have been a number of court rulings, Bombay High Court in Sesa Goa, Rajasthan High Court in Chambal Fertilizers, which have held this position that cess is not part of tax, can be claimed by taxpayers while computing business income. And they, in a way, these courts have relied on the fact that in other provisions of the income tax law, cess has been used differently from tax. Where the government intended to use cess differently from tax, they have mentioned it differently. In this particular provision, it has not been mentioned differently, and therefore it was not meant to be covered. And also there was a government circular which specifically clarified that cess word was omitted from the language of this provision, and therefore the intention was not to include cess, which could have otherwise been claimed as a deduction. Now, this amendment again overturns those decisions. In addition, what it does is it overturns retrospectively, which is, I think, in the budget proposal, there is one express retrospective amendment, which is this amendment. This point of view that cess is never part of, or cess has always been a part of tax, is now applied into the law retrospectively from financial year 4-5. What it does is, for all taxpayers who have taken positions that cess is to be allowed as a business expense, now those positions will be reversed. There could be, say, additional interest, penal exposure. But I think practically speaking, penalty could be avoided because this is an amendment because taxpayers have taken a particular point of view based on High Court decisions. And this is in a way a retrospective amendment. So I think penalty taxpayers can avoid. Also, there have been few decisions, court decisions in Supreme Court in GSW Steel, Calcutta High Court in MRME, where courts have also allowed taxpayers that they should not be liable to pay interest under 234B or C if that interest is on account of a retrospective amendment in law. So I think those case laws could come to the rescue of taxpayers to hold that there should be no interest or penalty that should be leviable because of this retrospective amendment in law. Okay, we move on. Next is withdrawal of the concessional taxation regime of foreign dividends. Now, this is really applicable for Indian MNEs which have investments outbound, and they earn dividend income from their say overseas subsidiaries. Under the law, there was a special regime which provided for a tax rate of 15% on foreign dividends. Now that regime is withdrawn now, effective financial year 22-23. And taxation of foreign dividends is now at par with taxation of local dividends. If local dividends are taxable at applicable corporate tax rates, so will be the foreign dividends. I think this should not impact companies which are receiving foreign dividends and distributing onwards to their shareholders, because the deduction under Section 80M will still be available. The last point is on unexplained cash credits. The government clarifies that the taxpayer needs to explain the nature and source of any loan or borrowing. In addition, the creditor also needs to explain the nature and source to the satisfaction of the assessing officer to avoid taxation of this unexplained cash credit in the hands of the taxpayer. This is really, if you look at the memorandum, the intent is to avoid unaccounted money getting into the books of accounts by way of loan or borrowing. That's been the intent behind the introduction of this provision. Pankaj, anything to add before we go to the next slide?
So, Anuj, I think the only point to add on the unexplained cash credit is, this has been the matter of extensive scrutiny by the tax officer, in the course of assessments. While so far it has been picked up more for the share application money and, the capital money coming around, I think this budget amendment tries to extend the requirement to provide the source of the fund, apart from the genuineness and the creditworthiness of the creditor, to loans and borrowings. I guess to take into account the money laundering and other aspects, and to kind of cut that kind of loop. I think what I can foresee is that during the course of assessments, people taking borrowings, would have to go back and get the source. So how would one satisfy this requirement before the officer is going to be a challenge, Anuj, because, how do you establish the source of the funds which the creditor has, kind of been able to get at his or her level, so I think we'll have to watch out how this issue when the money used to come by a share application or from a shareholder, it is slightly easier because, that person happens to be a shareholder of your company, but a creditor, or because this goes on to say any other liability which is credited, to your account. So I guess one will have to wait and watch how the taxpayers will be able to justify or satisfy the tax officer the source of the funding, specifically with respect to loan and borrowings.
Yeah, adds to the troubles of the taxpayer to do more and more compliances around explaining unexplained credits. Okay, we can go to the next slide. This is really taxation of IFSCs, and IFSCs, for the benefit of everyone, is International Financial Services Center. And before I get to the specific amendments, IFSC is a special region in Gujarat, and the government has been wanting to make this region a global hub for, or really a gateway for inbound and outbound investments into the financial services sector. It was first operationalized in 2015, and since there have been a lot of tax incentives that have been given to units to set up in IFSC to non-residents to make investments in IFSC units. And also from a regulatory standpoint, there have been a lot of concessions given to businesses wanting to set up bases in IFSC. And I think even if those businesses, they're set up in IFSC from a regulatory standpoint, those businesses could still be qualified as a non-resident or a person resident outside India and be eligible for a lot of tax breaks. And since its first operationalization, we have seen a lot of tax incentives that have been already given by the government year after year from its initial operationalization. This year is again no different. Those tax incentives that earlier existed have been extended into a lot more categories. And we have also heard in the budget speech that government is also incentivizing foreign universities and also make this region a seat of international arbitration. I think these two are big announcements by the government to further incentivize IFSC. Now, from a tax standpoint, what this does is this exempts income of a non-resident who is investing in IFSC or earning income from transfer of, let's say, offshore derivative instruments, over-the-counter derivatives, which are signed with an offshore banking unit in an IFSC. Earlier, the exemption was already existing for transfer income on transfer of forward contract securities. Now, this year, exemption is extended to other derivative instruments. Now, last year in Finance Act 2021, the government incentivized leasing of aircrafts to units operating in IFSC. This year, we see extension to leasing of ships as well. So if there is an income earned by a non-resident on lease of ship to a unit in IFSC, income of a non-resident in the nature of royalties to be exempt from tax in India. And there are a few conditions to be fulfilled for claiming exemption. Another few tax holiday provisions introduced in IFSC, and also income earned by a non-resident from a portfolio of securities or financial products, which is administered by a portfolio manager situated in India. Again, in an account maintained by an offshore banking unit in IFSC, is to be exempt from tax in India. So as we see, there have been some tax incentives already existing. Those tax incentives have been extended, and they are being extended year after year to further incentivize and to further maybe act as a catalyst for businesses to set up bases in IFSC. And really, the intent of the government is to make IFSC a global hub for inbound and outbound investments in financial services sector. Some of the PSUs in financial services, some of the PSUs who have been taking ships on lease for various gas LNG transport business. It could be particularly relevant for those enterprises if they're looking at setting up bases in IFSC.
So Anuj, if I can just add a couple of points, on the IFSC, clearly, the intent of the government is very clear to make IFSC as a global financial hub. I think the longer objective is to have the financial institutions, based in foreign countries to come and settle in IFSC and providing that tax regime, so you clearly see, that while on one hand, government is removing all the incentives and the exemptions, at the same time giving out, incentives in IFSC year by year and adding more incentives, and more players are getting added, than the earlier list, so to speak, right? So I think clearly intent is evident. In fact, if I can just speak outside tax, I think what is very interesting to note in this year's budget is, government is also keen to allow world-class foreign universities, to set up their kind of, campuses in IFSC without any domestic restrictions, except for obviously the IFSC regulations. While we'll have to wait and watch how the foreign universities will be allowed to open and not comply with the current education laws. But I think the messaging is important over here. It's like giving a message to create an ecosystem whereby it allows the expats, it allows the portfolio managers sitting in, say, Singapore, to actually come and kind of shift to IFSC. Because while the setup is there, I think the challenge has been to get talent in IFSC and run these businesses. So, I think some of these allied opening of, education and other areas is going to be a long way in making this as a global hub. So I think these are a couple of quick takeaways, from my side.
We'll get to the amendments on the right-hand side. There have been few time extensions, one for startups. So there was a tax holiday for startups for 3 years out of 10 consecutive years since the date of their incorporation. And that date of incorporation was earlier 31st March 2022, which has now been extended by another year. Again, the intention is to create a conducive startup ecosystem, incentivize more and more startups to be coming up and taking benefit of this tax holiday provision. The second extension is similar to above, is extension for domestic newly incorporated manufacturing companies to commence their manufacturing operations by 31st March 2024 now, to be eligible for a lower corporate tax rate of 15%. This timeline was earlier pegged to 31st March 2023 because of the disruptions caused by the pandemic, and because the PLI scheme introduced by the government has been very attractive. It has been attracting a lot of investments, and because of these two reasons, the government has now extended this timeline by one more year.
So again, what is interesting with this amendment is that government has not waited for next year, 23, to announce the extension for 24, and therefore giving a signal that you have 2.5 years from now to set up a manufacturing plant, and there's to that sense there is a clarity of a longer kind of haul. But the industry expectation was that many large plants it's difficult to set up in 2.5 years at time. So maybe a clarity around say 25, 26 would have been more welcoming, than just 1 year extension. So I think it has both the aspects, in terms of the expectation and slight, dampener to see the extension only for 1 year, but say not for 2 to 3 years.
Yeah. Probably, I think government is wanting more and more setups to be operationalized as soon as possible, not give them a window of say 1 more year, because that could probably push some of the investments to maybe abeyance for some time. We can get to the next slide, please. So this is some M&A amendments. The first being amendment relating to divestment of public sector companies, and there is a provision in the law, section 79, which is an anti-abuse provision, which restricts carry forward of losses whenever there is a change in shareholding exceeding 49%. And this exemption is specifically carved out for public divestments of public sector enterprises. Now, those erstwhile public sector companies can carry forward their losses even after strategic divestment, provided the owner, really the buyer of these public sector enterprises, continues to hold at least 51% of the voting power. This probably is made for various public divestment projects or various public divestment announcements that we have been hearing that the government is wanting to undertake. It could be BPCL, Air India, and so on and so forth. So that the losses that sit currently in those public sector companies are not impacted, and they can be carried forward to the buyers and can be utilized eventually when there are gains. Second is an important amendment from a M&A perspective on business reorganization. And this is maybe better understood with the help of an example. We can take maybe an example of, say, company A merging in company B, company A being a predecessor company and company B being a successor company. So wherever these business reorganization of these sorts take place, company A will go to the approving authority, say a National Company Law Tribunal, NCLT, to approve the merger scheme, which process is not easy. It takes time. Probably it could take few years, 2 years, 3 years. Now, during this pendency, when a scheme is filed with a court or with a adjudicating authority, there could be, say, significant time lapse, could be 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. And then for these 2-3 years, there needs to be compliance done by both the predecessor entity and the successor entity. Until the time the scheme is approved, they will operate independently, as if predecessor is separate, successor is separate. Now, oftentimes we've also seen that in those merger schemes, the date of operation, the effective date is pegged to a prior date. Say, while the court approval takes, comes 2 years down the line, the merger scheme will be applicable from the prior date, say from today's date, the date when which the application is filed. So I think that if a merger scheme is applicable from the date application is filed, then effectively the successor needs to be bearing all liability from that effective date. Now, what is happening is for those during the pendency of scheme before those adjudicating authorities, predecessor was filing its own returns. It was getting assessed on the returns it was filing in its independent capacity. And then court approvals came through. Now, successors used to take a point of view that because the court approval is effective from a prior date, assessment on the predecessor could not have been done because the predecessor was not existing. It was not a valid entity after the High Court or maybe after the court approval. And therefore, assessments were held to be bad in law. Now, this amendment, what this does is this deems assessment done on predecessors to be assessments done on the successors. So those assessments done on predecessors will no longer be invalid. They'll be validly done in line with law as if they've been made on the successor. That is point number one. Point number two is successor relying on court decisions were filing tax return in a paper format, and there were decisions that allowed successor entities to do that, Dalmia Cement, etc. Now, this amendment allows successor entities to go back in time, modify its tax return, include income of the predecessor from the time the merger scheme is effective. And this can now be done in a digital format because there is an enabler in the law expressly, and they need not do this in a paper format as was being done earlier. A welcome move, for it will help streamline the processes both on the predecessor front and on the successor front, and will help digitalize the processes that were earlier being done in a paper format. On the right hand side, what you see are some adjustments, some clerical changes that have been done pursuant to amendments brought about by Finance Act 2021. Some tweaks around words that were incorrectly left out last year. Sale has been is corrected to be replaced with transfer and so on and so forth. Pankaj, anything to add before we get to the next slide?
I think we can proceed.
Next slide, please. I think there's one slide that we have missed on VDA. I don't know if it is, if we can go back to the slide before the earlier slide. One more slide.
VDA will be taken up by Nitin.
Okay. Okay. That is perfect then. Okay, so we can go to the next slide, please. Yeah. So this is an amendment more from a procedural standpoint, and the first on the left-hand side is really a litigation management strategy. And what has been done is where there has been say a particular question of law pending in a taxpayer's case, and if that question of law is identical and pending in the same taxpayer's case for another year, or pending in another taxpayer's case before, say, a High Court or a Supreme Court, then the collegium, which is 2 or more commissioner or chief commissioners of income tax, now they can direct the assessing officer or the revenue authorities to not file an appeal and wait for the outcome of those identical questions of law pending in higher appellate forums. Once the determination is known, then that determination can be applied to the outcome of a question which is pending in a taxpayer's case. This can only be done when the collegium takes approval from the assessee that the question of law pending in its case is identical to the question pending in the other case. The intent behind this move is to declog some of the litigation where we see Indian revenue filing appeals after appeals wherever there are positive orders in favor of taxpayers, just to declog some of the pending litigation. This helps on that front. What it also does is it in a way maybe it puts fate of taxpayers to an outcome which is pending in somebody else's case. So if taxpayer has now signed up that its question of law is identical, and if say in the case where the question of law, identical question of law, is decided against the taxpayer, then the taxpayer's fate is eventually to be decided by the outcome of that decision. So I think this is really a plus and minus both for taxpayers and Indian revenue, but the intent is really to manage litigation from a long-term perspective. Again, not a new provision. This provision existed in the law, but it existed in a limited format where the pendency was to be seen only in case of pendency of cases or identical question of law in taxpayer's own case for another year before the Supreme Court. But now with this introduction, it has been expanded to a broader, it has in a way, the section has been broad-based and the earlier section is now having a sunset clause.
So Anuj, I think, the way, I look at this amendment is more than a taxpayer measure. It is more, the overall litigation management cost and the, time frame, which the department used to suffer filing appeal by appeal on the similar question of law. And as you rightly said, I think this law was there earlier, but that was only applicable qua the own SSE's case. But now they have extended it to any question of law again before the High Court or Supreme Court against any other taxpayer. So I think that is one kind of making it more enlarging, which allows them to defer filing the appeal till the outcome of the question of law by High Court or Supreme Court. The only silver lining is that the department cannot defer the appeal unless it takes the approval from the respective taxpayer. So I think maybe that could be probably a silver lining, where taxpayer believes that the question of law is not similar, or it is slightly different than their fact. It can actually challenge deferral of the appeal by the department. So that's the only silver lining I can see. Otherwise, I agree with it's more a litigation management exercise, which allows the department not to incur the repetitive cost and time, in filing the appeals.
Yeah. And if we read the fine print, I think one interesting point that comes out is the question of law has to be pending before the High Court or a Supreme Court. Now, the pendency before the High Court needs to be seen only qua an appeal before the High Court, not a writ before the High Court. So if a writ is filed before the High Court, then that cannot be applied as an outcome to taxpayer's case. I think that is one fine reading of law. Probably, I think maybe a miss could be corrected once the bill is to be enacted in due course. Now, on the right-hand side, we see a new provision introduced allowing taxpayers to file updated returns. We know under the existing law, taxpayers could file belated return, revised return, regular return, and there was a process timeline in the law until when they can do so. So at the most, say for a given year, taxpayers have time until 9 months from the end of the year to file belated returns or revised returns. Now, what this provision does is it allows taxpayers, it gives them more time, which is 3 years from the end of the relevant year. And wherever they think there have been some omissions and there is an additional tax liability due on taxpayers, then they can file this updated return to pay off the tax that is due on the income that is not reported earlier, plus an additional tax that is to be paid. And that additional tax is defined to be 25% of aggregate tax and interest, or it could be 50% if it is filed after a point in time. Now I think in terms of maybe the implications that come out from this provision is not applicable in all cases. There are some exclusions, and those exclusions is say wherever there is an assessment already initiated, then assessee will not have right to file updated return. Wherever there are search and seizures initiated on the taxpayer, wherever there is a questioning asked from a Benami Transactions Act or a Money Laundering Act, then assessee will not have right to file updated return. Now, I think if you look at some of the implications, the objective of the government is to ensure voluntary compliance by taxpayers, not that if there is an omission. In all cases, government's recourse is only assessments, but they are incentivizing more and more voluntary compliance. But if there is an omission, if there is an exception that in case of assessments, taxpayers cannot file updated return, and we now see the timelines for assessments are being accelerated. We see assessment notices coming as early as 3 months, 6 months immediately after filing of tax return. Now, in all those cases, taxpayers may not have right to file updated return. That is in a way a bit of a dampener, but I think we'll have to wait and see as this provision gets implemented and it pans out.
So Anuj, I think clearly to me, it's like, same product in different package. We used to have VRS, VSV. It is very similar to that kind of scheme, right? To take into account a taxpayer who's completely got scot-free, either by not filing the return or by not being picked up by the assessment, and the person realizes, like, after a year, 2 year, or 3 year that some income has been escaped. So I think this allows them to file the return and kind of comply with the law. So I think interesting move, and I think I'm sure what is interesting to note is the memorandum while explaining the introduction to this proposals also emphasize on the point that department has various data and it takes time for them to kind of read and disseminate and kind of understand. So I'm anticipating, okay, there could be a situation that if say a taxpayer doesn't come suo moto, they may just raise general query based on the intelligence that they've got, and that may lead to them filing the updated return, because there will be a lot of situations where the timing of return has been crossed. There's no time to file the belated return. So I think this finds a very sweet spot, which allows not only taxpayer but even department to go after the taxpayer and accept and file the updated return.
Correct. Yep. And I think what also it does is it could, so once the updated return is filed, there's a timeline cap of 9 months from the end of the financial year in which updated return is filed for assessment to be completed. And I think I'm just preempting some of the questions which could be, so can a taxpayer file updated return in a case where the taxpayer has not filed original return? Answer is yes. Can a taxpayer file updated return in a case where taxpayer has already filed, say, a regular return, belated or revised return? Answer to that is again yes. But in a case where a taxpayer, say, for instance, has not filed original return and there is a refund due legitimately, can a taxpayer use recourse of updated return to claim refund? Answer probably could be no, because updated return can only be filed when there is an additional tax liability to be paid on filing of tax return. I think these are some of the questions that have been, that are being asked in public forum. I just thought I'll take it as we are dealing with this section. We can move on to the next slide, please. Okay, so this is rationalization of a reassessment provision. So rewinding back to last year, Finance Act 2021, when the timeline to open reassessments were reduced from 4 years, 6 years to 3 years. And only in exceptional cases, taxpayer could have gone to, or maybe tax officer could have gone to 10 years to reopen assessments. That was pegged only to very few exceptional cases. And now what this amendment does is, earlier taxpayer or tax officer could have initiated assessment only in few cases where there was some information in possession of the tax officer, basis which he could have reopened assessment of a taxpayer. When I say reassessment, for the benefit of everyone, I'm meaning wherever tax officer believes that income of a taxpayer has escaped assessment, and there's a provision in the law to allow tax officers to open or to reopen assessments. Now, the realm of information in possession of a tax officer has been expanded. Earlier, the meaning of information was limited to some information received by tax officers from risk formulation board or from audit objections from CAG. But this information scope has been significantly expanded. Bullet points or sub-bullet points you see on the left-hand side: any audit objection, any information received from foreign jurisdiction under exchange of information program, any information received from different units under faceless assessment, any information, and this one is important, any information that requires action in consequence of an order of a tribunal or court. Now, under all these mechanics, tax officer can now reopen or open assessments in case of taxpayers. Now, I think if you were to analyze it more closely, what it does is earlier the provision was for reassessment was where tax officer has reasons to believe. That was, and that led to a lot of subjectivity as to what is the meaning of reason to believe. That was done away with. A scope of information in the possession of taxpayer was introduced. Now, the meaning of or the realm of information is now expanded to a lot more activities. So I think this amendment, it undoes what it did well last year. This in a way is just maybe expanding the scope of reassessment that could have been done. The second change is what you see on the right hand side when I talked about in exceptional cases, tax officers could have opened assessment for 10 years. And that exceptional case was only limited when the assessing officer had some books of accounts or documents that revealed income represented in the form of an asset that escaped assessment. Now, bullet points 2 and 3 have been added again to the scope this year, where tax officer has evidence that an expenditure in relation to a transaction, event or occasion, or an entry in the books of accounts exceeding 50 lakhs has escaped. Then there are more ammunitions in the hands of tax officer to reopen or open assessments for up to 10 years. This again, in a way, elongates the process of achieving tax certainty for taxpayers. The third change is really a procedural change. The law earlier required tax officers to take approvals at different stages from senior administrative authorities before they can interact with taxpayers. That process of taking approvals is now streamlined. I think reassessment provision is an important provision. It gives more to the tax administration to go after taxpayers. And in this, in a way, is also undoing of what has been done right previously.
And Anuj, clearly, I think what is for me the most striking aspect is, the scope for reopening was reduced from 6 to 3 years last year. And only on the exceptional cases, it was extended to 10 years. Now, if you keep adding the list or the bucket of scope of 10 years, is it effectively, in true sense, expanding the limit from 6 to 10 years or really reducing from 6 to 3 years? Because if you look at item 2 and 3, they are quite broad and quite subjective. Like in a sense, effectively, virtually all the cases, I would say, would get covered over here, which allows the officer now to reopen up to 10 years, as opposed to law before last year, which was 6 years.
Yeah. Okay, so I think next is again a very looks very innocuous on the face, but could have far-reaching implications. TDS on benefit or perquisites. Now, this is a provision where there is a person extending, providing for any benefits or perquisites to a resident taxpayer in India, which value of which exceeds 20,000, is required to undertake tax withholding at the rate of 10%. Now, when we look at this section from the lens of budget speech, it seems to be applicable in limited cases where there are some benefits extended to agents as a part of business promotional strategy. But the fine print in section 194R seems to be very wide ranging. It could impact a lot of cases, not really limited to agent principal transactions. Now, the language is as plain as any provision of benefit or perquisite exceeding 20,000 paid to a resident is to be subject to tax withholding at the rate of 10%. Applicable from July 1, 2022. This could probably trigger a lot of cases where some companies used to extend benefits or give tour options to a lot of dealers, a lot of agents as a part of business promotion strategy. Now, all those gifting grants or benefits extended to dealers, to agents, they are now part of the tax net. Under the law, those recipients, they were always liable to pay tax under section 28 as part of business or profession income. There is now, to deepen the wide net, there is now an obligation on the payer to undertake tax withholding at the rate of 10%. I think this will be quite interesting. As I said, this looks very plain, straightforward, but this could have far-reaching implications, and it'll be worthwhile if the government probably just explains this in a tight manner, so that everybody knows as to what transactions are really getting impacted by this provision.
And Anuj, if I can add to this amendment, the first aspect is what you highlighted. How do you evaluate or determine whether it is indeed a benefit or perquisite, in course of the business of the recipient, so to speak? Well, that evaluation itself is subjective, not clear what gets covered or not. But more importantly, the onerous task of evaluating the same has come to the deductor. So now deductor will have to evaluate from the recipient point of view whether that tantamounts to a perquisite in the course of his business. So I think that is going to be quite a challenging task. And as you rightly said, one would expect some guidelines to be laid down, for this process. And the threshold limit of 20,000 is too less. And I think the amendments also clarify that if you give something in kind, the debtor has to make good the TDS liability from his or own pocket. So I think clearly intent is very clear. I think the intent to, while this benefit a perquisite provision was always there in the 28(4), I think government believes, based on the information that they have, the recipient was not reporting it in the appropriate manner. Many of them were actually not reporting the benefit. So by casting the responsibility on the deductor, they expect a better compliance. So it's like shifting the onus to the deductor. But I feel implementing this provision is going to be quite a task, from the deductor point of view.
Yeah. If we can get to the next slide, please. Yeah, so these are some amendments, proposals relating to TDS provisions, tax deducted source provisions. We saw in last year's budget, there was a provision added that if a payment is being made to a specified person, and specified person is really a non-compliant person who has not filed tax returns for past 2 years, then the TDS obligation is really getting doubled. Now, there is an amendment this year that has maybe reduced the threshold, so that more and more taxpayers fall within this net. And in a way, this incentivizes taxpayers to undertake tax compliance whenever there are TDS done and whenever there are transactions of substantial size undertaken in any of the years. Now, if a payment is made to a person who has not filed tax return for the immediately preceding year, from the year in which the transaction takes place, and that person could be a specified person, and the rate of tax withholding could really be doubled. So as I said, the threshold for applicability has been lowered, which will lead to more and more taxpayers getting in the net and could lead to higher application of tax withholding. Second amendment is important, is on tax protected contracts. Wherever say a resident taxpayer is bearing liability of a non-resident, and it is a tax extra contract, if I can call so. Then the earlier process in law used to provide that taxpayer can pay applicable taxes, can approach the Commissioner of Income Tax Appeals to ask for refund if there was no tax due otherwise on the payment to a non-resident in accordance with law. But now this amendment in a way elongates the process. This amendment requires now resident payers to first approach the assessing officer for a refund of taxes that have already been paid under protest. Now, if assessing officer allows, good. If assessing officer doesn't allow, you go to the Commissioner Appeals. I think under the earlier provision, you could have gone to the Commissioner Appeals directly. This in a way elongates the process, streamlines it more as a process, first to the assessing officer, then to the Commissioner Appeals. On the right-hand side is there are some computation of interest whenever there is a failure to deduct or to collect tax at source. Now, there have been a lot of controversies as to if there is an interest, if there's a delay in deduction or delay in deposition after deduction of tax at source, then how will the interest be computed? How do you calculate days? If there is a delay of say 30 days, 40 days, then do you consider solar days, man days? I think how do you consider? If say there's a delay of 5 days ranging into 2 months, then will you consider 2 separate calendar months, or will you consider 5 days as one month? Now, there have been a lot of different positions, but I think what this amendment does is it requires taxpayers to follow what the assessing officer does in its order. You cannot simply determine what is the applicable interest on yourself. You have to go by the determination made by the assessing officer. The next is really a streamlining of TDS. There have been different provisions where wherever there's a transfer of an immovable property, then the valuation commercially agreed or the stamp duty valuation, the higher of the valuation was to be considered for determination of capital gains. But there was no similar provision in the tax withholding law, which is section 194 IA. Now they in a way have streamlined that higher of commercially agreed consideration or stamp duty valuation, even at the time of applying tax withholding at 1%. I think the difference is there is no safe harbor for tax withholding, as is the safe harbor of 10% that features in the law, which provides for a determination of income from transfer of immovable property. So no safe harbor here in the tax withholding provision. I think the last is similar, it's a duplication. Pankaj, anything to add before I go to the next slide?
No, I think the only point, again, it re-emphasizes the point that while at one end, all these amendments, intends to provide clarity or deepen the, the overall tax net, but some of them, especially, the interest aspect on the TDS default to be, based on the AO's order, seems to be quite arbitrary. Because one will have to just go by what AO decide, whether right or wrong, and you don't have any recourse, except obviously you have to file the appeal. So I think some of the amendment I feel is slightly arbitrary. It could have clarified whether you go by solar month, man month, or whatever basis. But yes, I think all these intend to clearly widen the net and also ensure that relevant information is captured at the withholding stage.
We can go to the next slide, please. Yeah, so this is really the last of the procedural amendments and quite a significant one, especially one of the clauses here. So the faceless assessment scheme that was introduced by the government previously is now almost revamped. There have been, the process is now laid out in the bill and also in the memorandum that explains the rationale for introduction in the bill. There are different interfaces in which taxpayer will connect with or interact with NFAC, which in turn will interact with assessment units, review units, technical units, verification units, and then the communication will be coordinated at one unison with the taxpayers. So those processes have been streamlined, but one important change here is there was a section in the law as it stood currently, which provided that if any of the process is not followed, then the entire faceless proceedings will be quashed. It will become bad in law. Now that provision is sought to be deleted by this budget, which is really, I think, the basis of contention in courts. There have been a lot of court rulings which have used that provision to reject and to strike down the assessment proceedings that have not been done in accordance with law. And that section was the main premise basis which high courts have struck down the assessment proceedings. And I think with this deletion of this important provision, the matters which are currently pending in High Court, I think their fate will need to be decided one way or the other, because this provision is now gone. And in a way, government has very subtly done this to probably win all pending cases before courts. I think this deletion could have far-reaching implications and could favor tax administration in general. You can get to the next slide, please. This is really a procedural change on charitable institutions. There have been there have been alternate regimes, 1023C and 12AB, which have been running in parallel. And I think the idea of these amendments is to streamline the two provisions to provide effective monitoring of the eligibility conditions that are being met, to provide for stringent penalty wherever the income of charitable institutions is applied for the benefit of the trustees or other specified persons. So it's just a streamlining of two alternate provisions that have been running in parallel, and to ensure more transparency and more reporting and to impose stricter penalty provisions. The last amendment is really about bonus stripping and dividend stripping in section 94. We have seen a lot of cases where taxpayers resort to these abusive measures where immediately before, say, a dividend payout or a bonus issuance, they buy securities, and immediately after they sell securities when prices go down, they book losses and then use those losses to offset against their other income, and reduce the overall tax outflow. So I think these abusive measures are sought to be plugged in, and the definition of securities is now expanded to include units in InvITs, REITs, AIFs, etc. I think what it does is, because dividends will no longer be tax exempt, so I think the impact of this change is to be seen more in the context of bonus stripping than dividend stripping in that sense. Pankaj, sir, anything from your side?
I think that probably the final comment from my side, before we wind up the corporate tax amendment is to highlight while we have not detailed out the charitable organization amendments, but definitely if a lot of PSUs have foundation through which it is doing CSR activities, I think some of these amendments could be relevant. And as Anuj laid down, I think what does this amendment do? And I think what we've been seeing is that a lot of amendments have been happening in the charitable organization space, more specifically because they enjoy the tax exemption, and therefore wherever there were gaps or there were, like interpretation issues or, things were not very clear in terms of, compliances, I think a lot of amendments or proposals have been brought in this budget to not only have those within the regime, and as Anuj rightly said, we have two parallel regimes. One is the Section 11 and another is Section 1023C, applicable to education and the hospital sector, So I think wherever there were gaps between both the regimes, it is now come and be aligned. So suppose if an amendment was there in one, not in the other, it got introduced in both the places, So I think this will have an impact in a foundation setup if any PSUs have that. Anuj, with that note, over to you.
Thanks, Pankaj, for all the valuable insights. I think this is all from direct tax. We can now get to personal tax. Over to Divya, Nitin, to you to take us through the individual tax proposals.
Yeah, thanks, Anuj. Yeah, can we move to the next slide? Yeah, so good afternoon, everyone. So just to give a quick snapshot, there were a lot of expectations from the budget that there would be a reduction of tax rates or widening of slabs or some increase in the deduction towards ATC. Now, while the tax rates have got unchanged, there are certain benefits or certain provisions which have been introduced. And I'll tell Nitin to take us through the provisions and then we can have a Q&A after that. Nitin, over to you.
Thanks, Divya. So I just want to add to what Divya said. To start with, what has not happened per se is that there was expectation of changing or tinkering of the tax rates to get them in sync with what the corporate tax rates are as of today. But of course, that has not happened. And then with the pandemic hitting us, we were also expecting a bit of change happening under Section 80D, which we haven't seen at all. But at least one of the good news is that there is no change in the tax rates from a perspective that they have not been increased in any manner. So that's a good signal from the government to stay put at what we are as of today. Coming to the specific amendments that have happened, yes, the regulators have been mindful of the fact that medical expenditure is the need of the hour. There is a lot of expenditure that the individuals, the various families, various people have incurred in the past 2.5 years. So you would see that this amendment that has taken forth is actually a retrospective amendment applicable from financial year 19-20. Just to break this down into a few pieces, the first part of the exemption talks about any sum that is being received by an individual from any person, including the employer. Now, please read this carefully. It says towards COVID-19 medical treatment. Now, if any medical treatment an individual has gone through or any other person has gone through, then any such money that's being received by that person is going to be exempted and it will not be taxable in any manner. So if you receive it from the employer, it gets covered as part of Section 17 of the Income Tax Act. And if you receive it from any other person, then it gets categorized under Section 56 of the Income Tax Act. And this is primarily the amendment that has happened in these two sections per se. So which means any medical treatment that you take and incur any expenditure regarding to that, and you receive that money from an individual or from the employer, that will be exempted. And there is no specific number that's been prescribed in terms of what the upper limit is. Some conditions as to how this is going to work, what backup information, documentation is required. All of that is likely to be notified because you will see in all the three situations, it says as may be notified. The second category is with regard to sum of money received by a member of the family of the deceased employee from the employer. Now, this is again without any kind of limit, but we have to bear in mind that this has to be received within 12 months of the demise of the person. Now, one factor I guess is important, and we've this notification will of course come out, but what will become important from an employer perspective is also to be borne in mind that does this, so we can take a simple example of a company going ahead and maybe funding the education of the children of the deceased employee for the next 15 to 20 years, where we are talking about children in the age group of, let's say, about 4 years to about 20, 21 years. Now, the question is that, does this need to be spread over the next 15, 20 years? Or do we make a lump sum payment now to the deceased family? I guess with this 12-month criteria being there, lump sum payment probably would be something which is more acceptable with the revenue authority, because then it doesn't get taxed at all. And then the third, this particular portion is again covering Section 17 because this is a payment being made by the employer to the employee's account and made to any other family member. The third portion is again in terms of any sum of money received by a member of the family of the deceased individual from any other person. And then again, this triggers Section 56, which is income from other sources. And this is up to about 1 million, which is about 10 lakh of rupees on account of COVID-19 related illness. And again, here we have a threshold of about 12 months that's been prescribed. So these are three new different demarcations in terms of what is the benefit that gets passed on to the individual or the employee or any other person being received either from the employer or from any other person that they would know. And as I said, this is a retrospective amendment. Devya, anything you want to add?
Yeah, the only thing I want to add is that last year the government had come out with a circular providing these benefits. Now it has been put as a part of the law and part of the act. Yeah, so it is a beneficial provision. The only thing that is important is the 12 months which they talk about. So that is something which would need to be borne in mind when someone is looking at making such a payment. Yeah, Nitin, back to you.
Thanks. The other important proposal that's there as part of the personal taxation regime is for the state government employees. We've seen that NPS, which is the National Pension Scheme, which has been gaining a lot of popularity for the last 7 to 8 years, and this has been in the offering. Private employees make use of it, and of course, central and the state government employees also make use of it. Central government employees, of course, had the benefit of claiming the deduction to the extent of the contribution being made by the employer, and this is, of course, in addition to what deduction the employee can claim, which is pegged at about 1,50,000 rupees. The good news is that now this deduction or this contribution that's being made by the employer towards NPS will also be available to the state government employee to the tune of 14%. It was earlier restricted to 10%, and this has now been enhanced from about 10% to 14%. So this is a good news, and of course, this gives an additional benefit to the to the employee of the state government. Any state government. Now, the other important change that's happened is the tax rate for individuals. Although they remain unchanged, which we have talked about, but there has been a big change that has happened in terms of standardizing the rate of surcharge on long-term capital gain. and this has now been capped at 15%. Now, what does this entail? And I've seen that there are questions that are coming, on the forum in terms of what this is all about. So, long-term capital gain is something, and a lot of people probably may have a thought that this is related to only equity shares or something. Please bear in mind, the regulation is talking about a long-term capital gain, and it can also cover an immovable property. Earlier, and what is the change? The change is that the surcharge is now going to be standardized at 15%, which means people who are in the higher income category, who probably eventually would have landed up maybe paying a surcharge of about even 37, a total number of 37%, has now been standardized to 15%, which means that overall outflow from an individual in terms of this long-term capital gain surcharge will be restricted to 15%. So that's a big change, and that's a big benefit. And bear in mind that when we are talking about larger transaction in terms of immovable property, so this will substantially help and serves the pocket of the individual very well with standardizing the number at 15%. Divya, anything you want to add?
No, nothing, Nitin, except that, for the private sector employees, the NPS still remains 10%. Beneficial move for the state government employees, and the long-term capital gain surcharge benefits especially people who are in a high income bracket where surcharge is 25% or 37%. Yeah, Nitin, back to you.
Thanks. Can we get to the next slide? I think that's an important slide, and we've seen a lot of debate post this discussion that happened in the Parliament, and then there have been a lot of speeches, there have been a lot of media articles in terms of what virtual digital assets are. I mean, to keep it simple, a lot of people know what cryptocurrency is, what bitcoins are. I think this is a new introduction, which has happened from the government side. Now, just to understand what they're trying to talk about, and before I dwell a little more into detail and talk about it, just to make everybody understand that, and why I'm focusing more on that is from a perspective of the question that I've seen on the forum. Now, what is a virtual digital asset? This is primarily a cryptocurrency which we are talking about, and it has various forms that are there. I'm not getting into those details, but a virtual digital asset, which typically is a cryptocurrency, is what the government is talking about. While the speech was on, and if you read the fine print also, they've also talked about digital currency. Now, is digital currency and virtual digital asset going to be the same thing? Probably the answer to that is no. There is a clear distinction. Digital currency is something which the government is going to issue, which the RBI is going to issue in the future. And this is post the debate that happens in the Parliament in terms of that digital currency. So a digital currency is something which is a normal currency that anyone and everyone deals in, and the only difference is that it is going to be digital in nature. Details of that is, of course, going to follow. They've still not come out with the finer details, but then it's a matter of debate at the Parliament where they will talk about it, understand, and see how they have to take that forward. And a virtual digital asset is totally opposed to what a digital currency is. It is a digital asset, and it is a cryptocurrency which has seen a lot of which has seen a lot of movement in the past few years. I mean, just to take a very simple example of a large company like Tesla, it has Bitcoins shown in their part of their financials to the range of about $1 billion, which is clearly an indication of the amount of movement that is happening in the cryptocurrency market worldwide. But with this introduction, are we trying to say that this process has been legalized? Well, it is not. The answer to that is not clear, because any virtual digital asset that's being dealt with, and with these provisions coming in and taxability being announced, does not mean that they have legalized it. I think we will in the next few months. We should watch out for the space to see what they come out with and what they talk about. Because once that happens, we will get to know are they accepting it? Are they legalizing it? Because one factor that's very clear is that in terms of cryptocurrencies, anything that is being dealt in the market, and as of today, with this new regulation coming out, does not mean that they have legalized it. And the courts have also made a statement in the past that, any transaction which probably may be illegal in nature. I'm not trying to say that cryptos are illegal in any manner. I'm just trying to facilitate my answer, that any illegal transactions being taxed does not mean that the transactions become legal in nature. Now, coming to the specific provisions on what they talk about, they are fairly stringent in nature. So first of all, any transaction that happens in terms of virtual digital asset is going to be taxable at the rate of 30%. What they have said is that there will not be any kind of deductions permitted other than the cost of acquisition, which means any expenditure incurred to get hold of that virtual digital asset does not see deductibility overall in terms of calculating the capital gains benefit or the benefits that you arise out of it, which arise out of it. Any kind of most important is that while we see, whether we talk about an income from house property or we talk about profit and gains from business provision, capital gains, we generally see that the provision under the tax law talks about a carry forward and a set off. That provision is absent for virtual digital asset, which means that there will not be a beneficial provision in terms of carrying it forward or to that extent setting it off against any other head, which means that it to some extent is a little stringent in nature. And at the same point in time, if there is any gift of a virtual digital asset that happens, this again is also going to be taxable in the hands of the recipient. They've also made a provision of doing a TDS at the rate of 1% in terms of any payment that is being made in order to buy that virtual digital asset. So 1% of TDS is likely to be applicable in terms of that transaction that will happen. So this is all in a nutshell in terms of virtual digital assets and what is there on individual taxation. I want to stop here and pause and ask Divya to provide his valuable thoughts. And we'll of course take question and answer subsequently. Over to you.
Thanks, Nitin. So virtual digital assets, there has been a lot of debate and a lot of media coverage on cryptocurrencies, Bitcoins, NFTs in last few months. And this has been the need of the hour. And as Finance Minister also alluded in her speech that they are going to tax it, the legal framework is yet to come out. So we'll have to wait for the legal framework which the government will come out in due course of time to see what is there in the fine print. Meanwhile, the government did not want to wait for the legal framework to miss on the taxability portion, because there were certain questions which were arising in terms of whether such kind of gain or income would be taxable or not. So therefore, I think keeping that in mind, it is taxable. We will wait to see what comes out in the legal framework. And yeah, so that's all. And we will take the questions in the Q&A session. So that's all from our side.
Yeah, so I think Samriddhi, let us know what the next point in the agenda is. If there's anything we need to expand on in terms of personal tax, we can also talk about it. I already talked about at the start of the session that we were looking at a lot of beneficial provisions coming in. I guess one thing which was expected, other than this lowering of the tax rates and getting it in sync with what the corporate tax rates are, was a change in terms of leave travel allowance, which was introduced last year. And that's a provision which talked about taking benefit of a leave travel allowance and buying goods and services from the market. That was a useful provision that came out in the last year's budget, where you could go ahead and buy goods and services from the market where GST to the rate of 12% is applicable, and deductibility for that will be available to the employees. We have not seen an extension of that provision. It was useful not only from a perspective of an employee, but also to some extent giving a boost to the economy, because if we are going ahead and buying goods and services to the tune of GST 12% and above, of course, this helps in boosting the markets also a lot in terms of goods being bought out of the market. Yeah, sorry, Samriddhi, you want to say something?
Sorry, yeah. So we have Saloni with us next. So I think we'll be taking up that session first, and then we'll be moving on to Q&A.
All right. Thank you so much.
Saloni, we have Saloni Roy, who is partner Deloitte, and we'll be taking up the indirect tax section. So over to you, Saloni.
Thank you, Samriddhi. If we could move to the indirect tax slides, please. So while the slides are being shifted, what I'd like to say is that from an indirect tax perspective, what we've seen is that year on year, the GST changes are reducing, especially at the time of the budget, because changes are actually occurring during the year, as part of the GST Council meetings. And this year, what we see, the changes that have been announced in GST are essentially procedural. Of course, there were certain expectations that we had from GST. We were hoping to hear about the GST tribunals being set up, which has been causing considerable grievance, and taxpayers are having to resort to filing writs in the High Court. But we didn't see any announcements around that. Also on digital virtual assets, while we did hear about it even a short while back, we didn't hear any coverage from an indirect tax perspective on this, because this is a new way of trading and investments, and hoping that you would have seen something in the GST in the budget speech. But coming to that, what the specific changes that were announced this year, input tax credit, there were restrictions that have been introduced on availment, which are making it more stringent. So credit can only be availed if they're appearing in the records of the recipient. Sorry, what this means essentially is that a taxpayer can only take credit if the supplier's details are appearing in the 2B, which is auto-populated, and in only that circumstance will they be eligible to take the credit. Then the next change that I'd like to speak about is that in case, in the event a taxpayer has taken credit and tax has not been deposited by the supplier, in such a circumstance, the taxpayer will need to reverse this credit and also pay interest. So in a way, it is penalizing the recipient for non-tax payment by a supplier. So this will entail and require suppliers as well as recipients to be more connected as far as the GST compliance is concerned, because this could lead to interest costs arising for the recipient of supplies. A change which has been introduced retrospectively is with respect to no interest on input tax credit that was wrongly availed but has not been utilized. This was there even under service tax, and it was a recommendation which was made in the September GST Council meeting, and we are now seeing it being formalized in the law itself. Then there are certain trade facilitation measures that I would like to talk about. The time limit for availment of input tax credit and issuance of credit notes has been extended. It's been extended from 30th September to 30th November of the following financial year. is a measure that has been introduced is that if there is excess cash, a cash balance which is lying in the electronic cash ledger of a taxpayer, this can now be transferred to a GST registration of a distinct person. So this essentially means is that if in case there are branch offices of the same entity which has registration, GST registration, and there's extra cash in one, it can be transferred to another. While this is a good change, what we'd also like to see is that if there is excess input tax credit in lying in one registration, if that could also be allowed to be transferred to another registration of a distinct person. Maybe we'll see this in times to come. There was no relevant date prescribed for filing refund claims for supplies to SEZs. It has now been done by providing that the date of filing of the return for the supplies that were made will be considered as the relevant date. And from this date, for a period of up to 2 years, the refund claim can be filed. There is a retrospective amendment which has been made, reducing the rate of interest from 24% to 18% on ineligible input tax credit that has been availed and utilized. Then certain other compliance changes, provisions relating to cancellation of GST returns or GST registration due to non-filing of returns has been amended. So what the current law provides is that if for a period of 6 months, a taxpayer does not file returns, the GST registration can be cancelled. The period has now, the provision has been changed to say that the period shall be prescribed, as may be prescribed. So we don't have going forward, it will be as prescribed. The timeline for filing GST returns by non-resident taxpayers has been advanced to the 13th of the month from the 20th. So it's been advanced by 7 days. You can move to the next slide, please. Moving on to customs related changes. Broadly, the changes that were announced were in line with the government's philosophy of Atmanirbhar Bharat, Make in India. So these changes are supporting these initiatives of the government. Over 350 notifications, exemption notifications are being withdrawn, and another 40 which pertain to capital goods are being revamped. So broadly, there's a rationalization which is taking place, plus obsolete notifications, and also to support domestic capital goods manufacturing capabilities. These steps have been taken. And also what has been done in that in certain notifications, a sunset clause or sunset date has been specified to put a date till when these exemptions shall be available. Last year, there was a Supreme Court decision which struck down an investigation, a show cause notice, which had been issued by the DRI on Canon India. And the reason it was struck down was they found that the officer who had issued the show cause notice was not empowered as a proper officer, and hence this show cause notice was struck down. And it was on this ground that Canon won the litigation. To overcome this anomaly, there has been a retrospective change in the customs law to recognize that officers of the DRI, audit and preventive formations, they will all be recognized as proper officers and empowered to issue show cause notices. And this change is retrospective. Then there have been other changes which have been made in the tariff duty structure. There are certain tariff rates, duty rates, which were there in the notifications, which are being moved to the tariff itself. On SEZ reforms, there was an announcement in the past by the Commerce Minister that the SEZ law will be replaced. There will be a new legislation. We were hoping to see that in the to be replaced with a new legislation. We didn't see it right now. It will probably be released in shortly. Then the other reforms that were proposed with relation to SEZs was that the customs administration of SEZs, which currently is done on a separate portal which is exclusive to SEZs, will now move to the IceGate or the Customs National Portal. So it will all be consolidated on IceGate. So currently what happens is filings need to be done by SEZs on this separate, so bill of entries, they're all filings are done on this SEZ online portal, and then prints are taken, and then there are duty payments are made on the IceGate portal. So this is going to be integrated going forward. There was a mention that manufacturing programs will also be introduced for wearables, hearable, and smart meters. So these are essentially smart watches, Bluetooth speakers, and such electronic devices. So what would happen is that graded customs duty exemptions will be provided to encourage domestic manufacturing. So parts, raw materials will be can be imported initially at an exemption or a reduced rate, and then subsequently the rates will be increased. We can move to the next slide, please. So in the next slide, what I'd like to speak about is regarding the production-linked incentive schemes. We've already had 14 of these schemes, and they've been fairly successful. And again, this is all in tandem with the government's vision to make India a manufacturing hub and to empower and support manufacturing industry in India. There are two more PLI that there will be PLI schemes for manufacture of solar modules and also for 5G ecosystem. So all these are excellent news for the manufacturing sector, and I'm sure details are being awaited, and we hope to see that these measures do result in India becoming Atmanirbhar. Before I close the indirect tax session, I'd like to mention that it's almost 5 years since GST was introduced. So GST was introduced in July 2017, and one of the basis of agreement between the states and the center at the time of introduction of GST was that the state. Hello. So one of the agreements between the center and the state governments was that in case there was a shortfall in revenues, the center would compensate the states for any shortfalls. And in this regard, Ces had been introduced to fund this payment of shortfalls that the center would need to pay the states. Ces has been introduced for 5 years and will come to an end in June end. There are states that are asking for an extension. So I anticipate that there will be some discussion, negotiation by the center and the state on continuation of cess and compensation by the center to the states for at least a couple more years. But this is something that we'll probably see in the months to come. So that's all that I'd like to cover from an indirect tax perspective. Over to you, Samriti.
Thank you so much, Saloni. So we've had a very eventful insight into how we are being impacted by all four from all four aspects. Now moving on to the Q&A. And so my first question I would take on the economy side, and I would request the tech team to please put everyone on screen, the panelists on screen. So the first question I would like to ask you, Bhanumurthy sir, is that though the budget is long-term, what provisions, specific provisions in the budget will help meet the short-term objectives of growth and bring us back to the pre-COVID levels? Any 3 to 5 indicators that you think will help us move back? Over to you, Bhanumurthy sir.
So the recovery is a continuous process, and the policies is also continuous. So whatever the recovery that we are seeing right now is because of the very prudent policy measures that both fiscal and monetary policies adopted since the COVID-19 hit us. Okay, and it's part of the Atmanirbhar Bharat. In fact, it's not necessary that the reviving growth is just entirely the role of fiscal policy. And there is a monetary policy, and they have been extremely active. And I'm sure all of you know that even now, they continue to retain the low interest rate regime for much longer than what markets have expected. So I think there are macro policies, a combination of fiscal and monetary policies that was adopted, and I think it's helping us the recovery process. So, for the short term, I mean, the growth is not a short-term concept anyway. It's a long-term concept.
So very well put, sir. It's not, growth is a long-term process. It's going to be a step-by-step process. Now we have a live caller, Mr. Mahesh Mittal, who is former Director of Finance NHPC. He would like to ask a question. So Mr. Mittal, please go ahead. Please unmute yourself and ask your question. Mr. Mittal? Okay, why? Yeah, please go ahead, sir. Yeah, please go ahead, sir.
I have 2-3 questions on the income tax side. One is that there is exception in the, availing the 15% tax benefit for the new companies to be set up. And the manufacturing should commence before 31st March 2024. Earlier, I think it was 2023. Now it is extended by 1 year. Now, some of the projects have a longer gestation period, like in the hydro sector, the project takes 5-6 years. In the railway sector, the project takes another, say, 5 years. So all those projects which have a longer gestation period, they can't avail this benefit. So why there should not be a similar kind of scheme for those projects or those companies who have a longer gestation period? Should I ask the next question, or?
I would request you to please restrict yourself to 2. We have other questions.
I have one more question.
Second, yes, please.
The income tax department will not go for a litigation where an appeal is pending in the High Court or Supreme Court on a similar issue, provided they take the consent of the assessee, and there is a collegium which decides so not to file an appeal till the matter is decided. Why similar facility is not available to the assessee? Why the assessee should spend money on litigation on a similar issue where he has filed appeal and he will go on filing the appeal? So why there is not a level playing field available on both sides? Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. So Bhanumurthy sir, would you like to take up the first? Okay, your hand was raised. So yeah.
I have a question, so I thought I'll come later.
Okay. First, Anuj, would you like to take this up? Anuj and Pankaj?
Pankaj, do you want to go ahead, or should I?
Yeah, Yeah. So I think on Mr. Mittal, on your first question, very valid point, and this is something even I touched upon, during our presentation, that when you give a window of extension for 1 year, it may not be sufficient for various long-drawn projects, as you rightly laid down, the projects which has high gestation, so. I guess, and I think, even Anuj made a very valid point to say that, government intends the companies to quickly start the manufacturing as opposed to kind of, in a wait and watch kind of situation. And therefore, I believe, that I think if Make in India as a policy is to stay, government will continue to provide the stimulus, so probably we can expect a further extension as we move closer to 25, as long as, Make in India remains, government's central agenda, in terms of the overall policy level. So I think, unfortunately, as we speak, we have this outer timeline against which we have to work, hopefully try to get the manufacturing before that, the commencement. If not, I think various organizations, are also approaching the government through advocacy to see if the relaxation could be done, or, explaining the case to increase. So I think there could be some way where we can probably go to the government through advocacy and give the reasons why a longer period for a specific category of, manufacturing organization should be extended. Anuj, you want to add any point over here?
I think a very valid point, Pankaj. You said, I think there'll be representations made, and we as a firm can also take such representations to the government, because it is very important for businesses with long gestation, like the one talked about, so that there is clarity on day one itself, because manufacturing may begin, say, 2-3 years down the line, but the business needs to have clarity today that they'll be eligible for a lower rate. So I think a representation can be made, and we as a firm can take these representations to the government for a clarity.
Yeah. And I think coming to your second question, I think an excellent question, Mr. Mittal, and I agree with you that why wouldn't you have a similar, provision for the taxpayer? I guess, again, my quick reaction to that would be, as you would know, I think in more than 95% cases is, where the government loses before the tribunal. It's only maybe 2 to 3% which goes against the taxpayer or the assessee. So for multiple reasons, so I guess what they're trying to do is to avoid the kind of cost and time spent on the repetitive appeal, from the department, because that's one of the or entity who's litigating the most, So I guess my quick reaction is that. And what I can also foresee is that if such an enabling provision comes from a taxpayer perspective, yes, you could always defer filing the appeal, subject to seeking the approval from the department. Likewise, but not sure how many taxpayers want to take this, because considering the volume of appeals that typically a taxpayer files or SSC files as compared to a department. Anuj, you want to add anything on this?
No, I think, Pankaj, maybe a broader point. I think if the government would want to do this, I think that could probably be an outreach, because I think a taxpayer has a fundamental right to litigate, to follow a particular position, a point in a path. And I think if government wants to bind taxpayers to not file, I think that is an outreach, probably violating the right of taxpayers to litigate. And therefore, it may not be possible, strictly speaking.
Fair point, Anuj. Professor Bhanumurthy, you had a question.
Yeah, please go ahead, Professor.
Yeah, on the indirect taxes, if you look at the receipts part of it, now that we know that the GST compensation is ending, at least as we speak now, by the end of June 2022. But then if you look at the receipt side, they have specified something like 1,20,000 crore under the GST compensation cess. So why should, if it is really ending by June end, why should they project 1.2 lakh crore as compensation cess?
You have right that there is a projection now that they should not have. I'm not entirely sure of the reasons why they have done this projection, because if it is coming to an end, there should not be ideally any amount being projected for a period beyond July 2022. So yes, I don't have a specific answer to that as to why, but yes, GST collections we are seeing have been amongst the highest they've ever seen, and we're almost at the peak levels which were reached last year. And so yes, we've seen GST revenues being buoyant, but honestly, there is no reason for them beyond July 22 to have Ces included, because today the law doesn't allow for it. It's a very good observation that insightful observation that you made.
Yeah, I can still feel that GST is still a black box. You don't know the GST potential. We are very happy that it has reached 1.5 lakh crore per month, but we just don't know what is the revenue neutral rate. So we don't know what is the optimal revenue that we have to generate from them. Anyway, so we all work together.
Thank you, Saloni. Thank you, Professor. So I guess, like you said, black box, I would take the example of the pandemic. It's like the pandemic. We don't know what's going to come next. So moving ahead, a very interesting point in the budget regarding the cryptocurrency and digital currency. And we have an array of questions which we'll be very selective in taking given the paucity of time. So the first question directed at Nitin and Divya is with respect to that since RBI, with respect to the RBI digital currency, will it be tradable like the cryptocurrency? Are we looking at a currency exchange now, pretty much on lines of cryptocurrency? And if yes, how will it be different from the digital assets that are already there? And so, yeah, first this question, please.
Yeah, so I think the digital currency that they're talking about, which RBI will come out, will be definitely different from crypto. I don't think that will be tradable. It would be like a normal currency that we have, but instead of in paper form, it would be in digital form. But we will have to see once RBI comes out with digital currency, what guidelines it comes out with, what are the conditions or guidelines attached with that to be really sure on how it will work. Yeah. Nitin, you want to add something?
Just one thing that I want to add is that the provisions that have been inserted under the new legislation talk about this, virtual digital assets, and it talks about any other Indian currency or a foreign currency, and of course there are different kind of. So if you look at these virtual digital assets, there are almost about 1,000 odd virtual digital assets that are currently there in the jurisdiction, which is both internationally. And intention is, of course, to look at this in a manner where they would like to go ahead with trading of it. But how this is going to happen is something which has still not been clarified. As I mentioned also during the course of the speech, is that as of today, the clarity, there is a clear demarcation in terms of virtual digital asset, which is a cryptocurrency, and cryptocurrency can have various kind of names, Bitcoin, or there are RTDs, which are there. So there are different kind of forms that are there. But how the same is going to take shape in the future is something that will be coming out very soon. But yes, digital currency and virtual, a crypto is something which is going to be totally different in nature.
Okay, so before moving forward, we have a live caller with us, Papya Mandal. Ma'am, are you online?
Yeah.
Please go ahead.
Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am, you're audible. Please ask your question.
My question to the esteemed panelist, though not directly related to the budget, could you please throw some light on how blockchain mechanism works, especially in terms of NFT? And my second question is, since this blockchain has a huge energy requirement, so in line with digital currency, is there any plan to replace the system with any other parallel system? So this is my two questions. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am. So Nitin, Divya, and any panelists who would like to pitch in.
So, blockchain is a different concept altogether, where it is more as a computer-aided system. That is how you use a computer-aided software as a mechanism for transfer of this blockchain. So that is how one looks at when we look at blockchain, and it is great when a person creates a currency and then it is shared within the group, a selected group, and then it turns into a blockchain, and then there's a trading on that. You are right in terms of the exchange or the requirement for that. I think that is something which will need to be seen as we progress on this, because the legal framework is not out, and once we have the legal framework, it should address all the issues around that. Yeah.
Okay, Nitin, you have something to add to this? Okay, thank you. One related question, this first to Professor on this. What would be the impact, or what impact are we seeing of the digital and the cryptocurrency market or digital assets on the economy? Is it adding to the depth of the financial market, or is it adding to parallel economy completely? First, I would like Professor to respond to this, and then of course Deloitte.
Well, I think I don't think there's any direct answers. I can see Deloitte, your team smiling at me on this. The reason is even RBI doesn't know how it's going to pan out, how it's going to affect, and that's one of the reasons why there's so much of dilly-dallying on that whole legislation, which they were supposed to have brought it in the winter session of Parliament. But then, as somebody said, there is a difference between the cryptocurrency and the digital currency. Digital currency, as you have seen in the finance bill also, they have expanded the definition of the bank note. So the bank note includes whatever the paper currency that's being issued right now, which is already existing, but also the digital currency that's going to come up. So there is a broadening of the definition of the bank note, and it is not an asset, it is just a currency, right? And it's just going to add to the money supply process. And what will happen with this is it is going to improve the way we have. There are a lot of discussion about credit card also. When the credit cards came into the system, there was a lot of discussion about, credit cards are going to increase the money supply and all those things. But in my view, the money supply is going to remain same. But I think the velocity of money is going to increase because of the introduction of the digital currency. So it could have some implications on the overall monetary policy making, in a sense that it could lead to inflationary pressure, all those things. But I think that the balance between the money supply and inflation, I'm sure RBI will take care. But the current cryptocurrency is not going to come into picture in any of the issues which the monetary policy is going to look at.
No, very well summarized, Professor Bhanumurthy. The only thing I would add in terms of when you talk about parallel economy also, see, when you look at cryptocurrency, there is no legal framework right now. The government got it in the realms of taxation because it was seen that people were making a lot of money around this, and therefore that money had to be brought into the tax net. And there was no provision under the law to tax such a provision, to tax such income. And I think with the government coming out with a legal framework, that should address the issue of bringing some legality into the whole structure of the cryptocurrency or the virtual digital assets. So I think that should really help and address it.
Okay, thank you, Divya. Now, last two questions on cryptocurrency I'm taking, and then we'll move to taxation. One is with respect to if we transfer taxation of virtual digital asset received as gift, how will it be taxed? The law says on the hands of the recipient, but your views on that, Divya?
Yeah, so when we talk about how it will be taxed as a gift, the regular provisions of Section 56 should apply, where if it is being given to a relative, so then it will be as defined under the income tax law, then that should be exempt. But otherwise, the regular provisions of income tax of over 50,000 rupees should apply in terms of taxability of as a gift for such assets. Yeah.
If I can just add to Divya's point, that typically gets taxed as income from other sources at a full rate. If it's an individual slab wise, if it's a corporate or organization on a flat full rate.
Yeah, thanks Pankaj for clarifying that. Yeah.
Okay, and last question with respect to this. It says that if there is any devaluation from the date of tax payment versus return filing period, then can there be any scope of adjustment for the same?
See, I don't think so, because once when you look at the provision, the way they stand today, they're saying that the only deduction, let's look at two parts. One is the only deduction allowed to you is the cost of acquisition. The other is that any gain that you or any income that you have will be set off only against this income, not under any other income. And if there's any devaluation, the losses which are there, they cannot be set off, nor can they be carried forward. So in light of that, whether it is a devaluation, it should not have any, I mean, there'll be no issue of revising a return or taking any benefit out of that. Yeah.
And again, Divya, just to supplement, I think what is relevant is the point of time the transaction takes place, the transfer, that is the date, and that is the point of time when the taxability arises. Anything happens after that is not relevant, from the return filing standpoint.
Yeah.
Okay, so now coming back to the taxation part. So we have Shivam Srivastava with his query. Shivam, can you please go ahead and ask a question?
Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible. Please go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. Sir, my query is related to NPS. Like last year, what our finance minister did, they brought PPF into the ambit of taxation. If you are investing some 2.5 lakhs above, then it will be taxable, like something was there. So what I'm asking, as of now, today, what are their thoughts about NPS? Means whether like right now the limit is about 50,000, and some conditions are there, like if you are investing more than 2.5, if you are investing up to 2.5 lakhs, then you can take that amount. Or if you are investing some 5 lakhs till at 60 years of age, you can take that amount. But if the amount is more than that, some 60-40 split is there, like 60% you can take and 40% you have to stay invested. So there are two questions related to this, whether PPF PPF kind of things will be happening in future for this thing also, or and second thing, what is the best way to utilize this NPS thing, whether we should invest or we should stay away from it and invest in some other instrument. Thank you.
So there are two things I want to add. One is, see, PPF is totally on a different footing than NPS. PPF, whatever you invest, that gets covered separately under 80C as a separate investment. Coming on the NPS, yes, the government has been advocating that, and NPS, I think when I look at it, it has to be seen more as a long-term view, like if more as a retiral come investment benefit plan, investment benefit that you may want to look at. So you cannot equate it from the perspective of the returns part. I think it is more as a long-term retiral plan which one should look at. And that is what is important from an NPS perspective. Nitin, you want to add something to this?
Yeah, basically. So I think just to answer the second part, is NPS being recommended by us? Of course, yes, it is being recommended, and it's a scheme which started and has been embraced very well by by all sectors, whether it's private sector or it is the government sector. NPS has been giving a good amount of returns. If you say that should be advised, yes, there is a bit of risk also involved, because while we look at NPS, there is a combination of debt and equity that happens. So to the extent of equity, of course, there is a bit of risk, but overall the returns that we see under NPS have been fairly good. Other than the fact that we get a deduction under 80C, there is also deduction on the contribution that the employer makes. So yes, overall from a deductibility perspective, and we have to bear in mind that these deductions are available only if we are a part of the old regime. So all in all, it is good. Just one more point on the PPF part, which Divya has already answered. We have to also look at the overall combination of a superannuation, provident fund, and NPS, where it exceeds 7,50,000 rupees. So where the moment this number exceeds, there is taxability under the law. So that PPF is out of the ambit, but provident fund, which is your normal provident fund, which you contribute from an employer and employee perspective, is a part of that.
Thank you, Nitin. We have a question from Senior Manager Tax HPCL Madhusudan Leelaji. So the query is that in the union budget, it is proposed to reduce the concessional benefit of basic custom duty for project imports. Whether concessional benefit is applicable for setting up expansion of crude petroleum refinery. And if yes, what will be the concessional rate effective from 1st April 22 or 1st May 22 or 1st April 23? Saloni?
Yes, there are benefits. Project imports were specifically to notified projects, and they're increasing the basic duty rate up to 7.5% for project imports. For crude refineries, there are exemptions that are there. I don't have the specifics with me right now, and I can't give a specific answer on this, but definitely, you know, the schemes are not being withdrawn totally. It's just that they're being gradually phased out, specifically where there is capacity, domestic capabilities, where these equipment are available domestically. It is essentially on those lines. So while project imports is still there, it's not been removed entirely. It's the rate that has been increased to 7.5%. The usual rate on, which is still a concessional rate. It's not that it's not concessional. The usual rate of basic custom duty is around 10 to 12%. So we'll need to see the specifics for crude refineries.
Thank you, Saloni. We have some queries regarding the post office banking system. So can Bhanumurthy sir please throw some light on it very briefly? So
what is the question?
Exactly, sir, they're asking whether what do you mean by post office banking system, and whether they would be giving out loans as well. So what would be the exact mechanics behind it?
See, first of all, I mean, maybe they should ask their grandparents. Some of them will have some accounts with their post offices. So actually, Government of India has made that India Post as a payment banking system, right? And it is different from commercial banks, where they don't go for lending, but rather they have deposit mobilization and also the payments for many of the services that they do for the government. So in that sense, I think somebody asked whether it will lead to NPA. I must say that there is no scope for NPAs in the Indian post payment bank right now, because it's not going to lend to people like Malyas and other things. So in that sense, you don't. There's no risk of NPA getting into the payment system, I mean, Indian post payment bank. But the reason why we are insisting is that the penetration of the India Post, if you ask anybody in the rural areas, only one connection that they have with immediate urban centers is the postman. And they were doing more of a payment service rather than the post. So I think that connectivity was one thing that has been taken advantage, so that there is an increased financial access at the rural areas. So that service will still continue, and not really the loan business.
Okay, thank you, sir. We have one question regarding the cooperative societies provision as to what exactly is the impact of the change in taxation for cooperative societies, and whether the same would be applicable for non-profit cooperative societies. So Deloitte team.
So Anuj, probably you can add over here. So I think the change that they have brought about in cooperative society is to restrict the surcharge to 15%. I think in the earlier regime, they could have surcharge crossing beyond 15% up to a higher limit. I guess they realized that disparity compared to a similar kind of setup, and that's the reason how in the AOP context, the surcharge is capped to 15%. I think similar kind of relief has been provided to cooperative society. As far as the charitable society is concerned, they stand in a different footing than a cooperative society. A charitable society would anyways be enjoying the income tax exemption under Section 11 for carrying out charitable activities, unless that particular charitable society has not sought for the exemption. In that case, they would be treated at par with any other society. And and for that also, they will have to ensure that they form within these cooperative society laws. I think if they fall into that category, they should be able to take this benefit of 15% surcharge.
Yeah, to add, Pankaj, for cooperative societies, the rate of alternate minimum tax is also reduced to 15%, just to ensure parity with the corporate taxation. So 2 changes on cooperative societies front.
Okay. Thanks, Anuj.
Thank you. We have many more questions coming up, but we'll be closing with the last question here. In fact, last 2 questions. So one is with regard to the amendments relating to relief and COVID-related reimbursements. Since it's effective from 2019-20 and returns have already been filed and TDS deducted by employers, how will the benefit be claimed? So Nitin, Divya, would you take this up?
Yeah. So if there is still a timeline for, I don't think there's a timeline for a belated return, because that would have already gone, or filing a revised, sorry, not belated, but a revised return, but that timeline would have already gone. So the only other way is then to approach the commissioner to see if, you can take a relief over there under Section 264.
So, Divya, I just want to add one thing. While they've talked about this provision being introduced, and it's a retrospective amendment, they have also made a clarity that it is likely to be notified. So this issue hopefully should get covered, because this is probably an issue which a lot of people are going to foresee. And hence, they will come out with a clarification and a notification, which will indicate how this process has to be taken forward.
Okay. So last question for today. So this says there is a change in provision under Section 79 of the IT Act related to carry forward and set off of losses. Clarification is sought regarding this amendment.
Samidhi, what is the exact clarification or the question is? So yes, there is an amendment, but what is the specific question?
This is what the question says. There is a change in provision under Section 79 of the IT Act related to carry forward and set off of losses. Okay, sorry, I missed this. Citing reason, ease of PSU divestment. So please clarify the amendment done in this regard in the budget.
So I think what a government is trying to do, when they are taking this strategic PSU divestment, and divestment could be 5%, 10%, 15, whatever percent from the government side, typically these PSUs are held by an intermediary holding company, and with these kind of divestment, the ultimate entity which owns this particular business continues to hold beyond 51%, but your immediate shareholding could be completely diluted, once you do this divestment. So I think what they are trying to bring about is to say that during these strategic divestment, as long as the ultimate holding company, the beneficial holding company continues to hold more than 51%, 79 should not be triggered, which means the losses which this strategic PSU was carrying forward from the previous years will continue to be allowed in future years, even though there's a change in shareholding or new kind of promoters or new kind of investors have come into this strategic PSUs.
Okay, so with this we are running short of time, and we would end our interactive session here. So indeed, it has been a very informative session, and I'm sure it has helped everyone clarify their concerns and confusions and doubts with respect to the budget. But today's interaction would be incomplete if we don't have industry perspective. And for this, we are honored to have with us Mr. S. Saktimani, Director Finance, FACT. Sir has a rich experience in strategic planning, finance and accounts, corporate affairs, operations, quality assurance, and auditing. Prior to joining FACT, he has served in titular roles in Siemens Corporation of India Limited, and has also been associated with strategic PSEs like SAIL, Rashtriya Ispat, Nigam Limited, and EPIL. Over to you, sir, for your address and insights.
Thank you, Jane, for the wonderful session. The way you are conducting, it's really wonderful. Yeah, 1.5 years back when it started, it has, you brought a professionalism in doing the webinars. Definitely, I really, recommend you to create this type of system so that, everybody can utilize your professional way of working. Okay, I want all the PSUs to take the professional services of scope in conducting this type of activities also. Okay, really I appreciate. First, I wanted to, first of all, thank you, your team, for conducting a very professional. And respected Sukti sir, the man behind, taking the scope to the higher level. Okay, very good afternoon, sir. And I know that, you are taking the scope to the higher levels, and we are putting the foot in everywhere. Okay, with your leadership, I know the scope will take in the different levels also. And there are a lot of expectations. The people are expecting more and more from you. The way the question answers are coming up, it shows that, there is an expectation from the scope in a bigger level. Okay, and I think you have to conduct some of the classes, from this too, you have to take some of the things regarding the digital currency or whatever it is. You have to take a classes so that, people are demanding that. Okay, and Bhanumurthy sir, last 3-4 years, I'm just listening to him. Okay, the simple and respectable person, and give a little bit of critique as well as, giving a lot of suggestions for taking the budget to the forward. Thank you very much, sir, for a wonderful presentation. And Deloitte team, like every time, they are also very technical in nature, and they give very passionately. They will give everything, each and every questions. That used to be a definitely, in case if the question is asked from the Deloitte directly, they will be charging a very heavy amount, but it is coming at a free of cost. Let me be frank with you. I really appreciate the patience and the depth of knowledge what you're having. Okay, I'm answering that. Let me just see. India is celebrating Amrit Kal. Next 25 years considered as Amrit Kal, and the long term is being part of it. The direction or the vision has been given by the Prime Minister. One of the meetings with the vigilance people and other things. So this budget is also in line with that Amrit Kal, wherein we have to move forward towards attaining the resolution made on Atmanirbhar Bharat, and this budget is working towards that. As far as there are a lot of discussions regarding the digital currency and other things, sir. See, I have a little bit understanding in this. When I was going through that in the last 2-3 days, a lot of discussions are going on. So the finance minister is also has given a lot of explanation. What is asset? What is the currency? Bhanumurthy Saab has very nicely put up. The currency is not tradable. The assets can be tradable. It's a very nice, sir. We appreciate the way you have put up. Okay. See, there are only 91 countries have tried for this. Okay, they are in the process of making their own currencies as a digital currency or cryptocurrency or whatever you say. But only 9 countries have so far done, but not on a big level. But everybody is trying the level best. But let me tell you, they are talking about not as a trading, not as a other way around. They are talking about the transaction benefits from one place to another. The international transaction, in case if it is a blockchain based, then becomes easier. The transaction can be easily tracked so that it can. Now there are, we have a server. With the server, we are tracking the transactions. But maybe the blockchain technology, they will be in a position to track on its own. They will be in a position to leave it on its own, so the people can shift it from one place to another place. It will be a quicker transfer, so that will help in the international transaction. That's what is being thought of it. But let me tell you, let us wait and watch. Like in the parliamentary word, let us wait and watch. Let us not get into the conclusions. It's whatever we talk, it's all opinion. Okay, even RBI is not in a position to give its opinion. So how come we can give the opinion by sitting at the different places? It's very difficult. But still, yes, it's not a matter of decades, but it's the next 1 year. We are sure that something will going to come up in India. So let us wait and watch. But yes, obviously, the digital asset, India wants to disincentivize. Okay, the way the things are going out, the way the speculation is going up. Okay, one day it is going up, the another day is coming down. Whether it is supported by anything or not, many people are getting in without understanding of it. Okay, there are many people like the big forum like this does not understand the blockchain. How a common man will understand and go and put it in that. So in order to reduce the speculation, I feel the decision has been taken to charge 30% of it. Nothing, not many things to that. But still, we have to wait and see what is going to be there. So that's what I can say. And Shakti Saab in his present address, he has given up 5 important points for the PSUs. Being a PSU-based, crowd, people, I just want to touch upon. There are 5 things he has talked about. But the fundamental thing is a startup. He has done many things working in the startup, in a personal level as well as in the official level also. He is a supporter of startup also. See, our economic survey also listed out. Even though the startup has, first Indian unicorn has started in 2011, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, but today 85 unicorns are from India. Previously, the unicorns were only in Bangalore. Thanks to the COVID pandemic, every nook and corner of India, is trying to catch up the unicorn, and the startups are becoming everywhere. Today, it's not only Bangalore. Thanks to the internet, thanks to the webinars, whatever we are conducting, it is spreading everywhere. Wherever the people are there, they are starting a startup, they are becoming unicorn. And this is actually giving us an opportunity. So there were the discussions like, why not 2023? Why not 2024? Why it's a manufacturing? See, it's actually a policy which has come for a general people, a general entrepreneur to come up. Yes, a big company who is having a high gestation period definitely can approach the systematic way and try to get a n number of things like a PLI, which is coming up 90,000 crores. Okay, there is a 5G also, they are going to be big levels. And PLI in each and every area, the PLI is coming up. So, yeah, big organized sector, which is having high gestation period, definitely can approach the government and try to get a concession in a different levels. But a smaller startup, a smaller entrepreneur, there needs to be some type of incentives that is being thought of in 23 and 24, whatever we are talking about. That's what my personal opinion is. I think the Deloitte can rectify, otherwise Mr. Bhanumurthy can give us views on this. And like, I only request the PSUs. See, the PSUs, when we are saying the startups, again, I'm talking about the startups again. In the startups, when you are saying who has invested in the startups, the startup investors are coming from outside, from US, from the UK and Europe and other places. They are investing in our startup and they are minting money out of that. But hardly I see a few entrepreneurs like Ratan Tata as well as some Aditya and other people. They are investing on these startups, but not PSUs are actually taking it as one of the challenge, one of the opportunities. See, we should actually support, as a PSU, we should actually support these startups, and we should become, like IITs and IEMs, they are trying to develop their, nuclear centers. Then we should, as a PSU, also should develop a nuclear center for these startups and try to develop this and become our subsidiary so that we can get the benefit of this. The startups, when we are talking about, many of the startups are digital in nature. They are fintech companies. Many of them, actually, around 70 to 80% are fintech companies. And in the budget also, we are talking about the digital economy, the financial interventions to the digital economy, Internet of Things only we are talking about. So I request every PSUs, make your systems very simple, make it is e-enabled, bring, so many digital intervention which is coming like a payment automations or receivable automations, otherwise, the invoicing, accepting the invoices through the digital mode, doing the bill tracking to the people, those things try to incorporate. The world is there. See, the India is transferring itself into the digital economy within the short time. I hope, the PSUs, people who are participating maybe in the decision-making level will be definitely looking into these aspects and try to improve upon their systems to see that the next generation, when next 5 to 10 years will become fully digitalized, paperless, and utilize the benefits of whatever the system is coming up in the outside. And I think we can talk many things regarding this, budget also, but many things have been discussed already. I have been given only 5 minutes time. And thank you very much. Thank you each and everyone, Mr. Khan as well as Mr. Jain, for giving me opportunity. Thank you, sir. Namaskar. Jai Hind.
Thank you so much, sir. Indeed, a very insightful address, and we resonate your thoughts that we need to be ready for the future generation and putting India on the digital map now. And sir, your words of encouragement are a motivation for us, and we would make all efforts to benchmark against your yardsticks. Now that we have both the legislative understanding and industry perspective, I'm certain that going forward, we would be able to interpret the budget and understand its implications in a better way. This wouldn't have been possible without our esteemed panelists. On behalf of Scope and the participants, I would like to thank them for simplifying the budget for us. We're also grateful to Professor Bhanumurthy for his guidance in paving way for us to interpret the complexities of economics in a more simplistic manner. We're also humbly grateful to Team Deloitte for such a detailed and interesting presentation, and most importantly to the panelists for taking the question answers so patiently and making them interactive. Thank you so much. We also thank DG Scope for his meticulous guidance and roadmap. Thank you, sir, for always motivating and encouraging us. We are also very thankful to Mr. Shaktimaniji for his valuable time and his inputs on the subject. And sir, thank you again for encouraging us. A big thank you to Scope team for putting the webinar together. Last but not the least, gratitude to all the participants for their enthusiastic participation and being interactive and attentive to the webinar. Till we meet again, till then, stay safe, and Scope will bring to you another interesting webinar. Please stay safe, take care. Thank you. Thanks a lot.